Perfect. Hello all, and welcome to the first session of Deception Theory, Movements of the Liar by Jason Mohogeg. The seminar explores deception as a philosophical art form of the highest order, one requiring intricate mastery of the varying states of unreality, the dream, the nightmare, the mirage, the fantasy, the hallucination, the simulation, the vision, the memory, the enigma, the story, the wish, and the apparition, as the ghost or the shadow. Along these axes, we will also unravel the particular techniques of distortion, riddle, and encryption to make up the vast arsenal of the liar. To diagram such chimeric possibilities, a series of philosophical, literary, poetic, and aesthetic works will be summoned to the seminar's forefront, each rendering acute insight into the performativities of stealth, manipulation, seduction, and intelligence behind acts of great deceit. For deception radically alters our understanding of knowing, sensation, desire, body, and imagination through carefully designed prisms of intimacy and betrayal, play and violation, enchantment and disenchantment. Following the supposed last words of a medieval Persian assassin, the old man of the mountain, all is illusion, thus all is permitted. We will seek those typologies of artifice that bring thought to their extreme limits. For what are the most subtle procedures of insinuation and its delicate interplay of proximity and distance? What images induce curiosity, entrancement, infatuation, obsession, or self-destruction? What are the strange ethics of transformation, vulnerability, and subversion held by the charlatan, the trickster, or the saboteur? So it is that we will study the captivating dimensions of the lie, its obscure codes of concealment and unveiling, in all their complex manifestations. I'll now introduce our instructor. Jason Mohogeg is Associate Professor of Comparative Literature at Babson College. His scholarly focus is upon tracking currents of experimental thought between the Middle East and the West, with particular attention to exploring the concepts of chaos, violence, illusion, silence, madness, futurism, disappearance, and apocalyptic aesthetics. He has published several books to date, including The Chaotic Imagination, Neo-Literature and Philosophy of the Middle East in Palgrave Macmillan 2010, Inflictions, The Writing of Violence in the Middle East in Continuum 2012, The Radical Unspoken, Silence in Middle Eastern and Western Thought in Routledge 2013, Omnicide, Mania Fatality, and the Future in Delirium by Urman Press, and Night, A Philosophy of the After Dark by Zero Books in 2019. He is also the co-editor of the Suspensions book series with Bloomsbury Press and the co-director of the 5th Disappearance Lab. Now, I'll pass the microphone down to Jason.
Thank you everyone for joining in what hopefully is a really captivating conspiracy that we're going to run here. Just interestingly, the term conspiracy etymologically means to breathe together, as in respire or spiro. So it's something very intimate and vulnerable that we're going to attempt here. I was invited very graciously by the New Center to try out and test the boundaries of new works, unpublished works of mine with all of you. So that's a special occasion for me. And I thank you for all of you for being a part of it. I'm actually at work right now on volume 2 of Omnicide. It's a secret only for all of you to know. This is the final volume as well, which goes through all the sort of my interests in mania and madness, different formations of madness, but which has 3 books that cut into it. Book 1 at the outset of the text is called The Book of the 11th Hour, and it's a philosophy of doom. Book 2, which comes halfway through, is called The Book of the Opium Den, and it's a philosophy of delirium and intoxication. And book 3, which comes at the end, is called The Book of the Lie, which is a philosophy of deception, which is what I'm engaging here with you about. So, and the reason for that is that I actually think that there's an intricate connection between madness, but also doom and deception. If we are the generation that is increasingly approaching the desperate edge of the annihilation of a world, it's interesting to me that I think the liar becomes the most essential figure towards the collapse of sort of our universal structures. If any of you have ever read Italo Calvino's Invisible Cities, which is the story of Kublai Khan, the Mongolian emperor, sitting in his palace in Xanadu. And it's towards the end of his life, and he knows that his empire is inevitably going to collapse into ruin. He stops meeting with any of his serious ministers, any of his legitimate advisors, the Minister of Roads, the Minister of Commerce, the Minister of Law, and he only wants to meet with Marco Polo, a notorious liar and storyteller, to tell him the different narratives of the cities that he's supposedly been to. And very quickly, the Emperor Kublai Khan realizes that Marco Polo is lying to him, and that all of his cities that he's claiming to have been to are in fact just one city, that he's kaleidoscopically fracturing into infinite alternative cities. And actually, he appreciates this fact. And the reason is because he realizes he himself is doomed now to obsolescence, that he's going to vanish from history, and that all that will remain of him and his empire are stories, are rumors, whispers. And so you need a great liar to be your legacy. And so that's sort of one of the things that sort of intrigues me about this. To that end, then, there's a paradox in deception. I'm just going to go for a while, and then we'll do introductions about halfway through, if that's all right. There's an exceptional paradox for me, which is that deception for me is the lightest concept you could sort of approach, in that it requires you to have fluidity, amorphousness. A great liar has to use speed and play and transformation. But I actually consider it the most severe concept, to the point of being a fatal concept. And by fatal here, I mean that it's a matter of life and death a lot of the time. I've lived in and I write about figures who have written in totalitarian societies where knowing how to lie means whether or not you're executed one night or another, lying to secret police, lying if you're a refugee. One of the writers who we'll look at briefly today is Hassan Blasim, a great Iraqi refugee writer who literally had to smuggle himself across borders in Europe. Knowing how to lie gets him out of a lot of states of despair. And so there is a fatal aspect, a life and death sort of stakes to this, and also fatal in the sense of a destiny. I think deception is integrally linked to a sort of a concept of willed destiny, which we'll get into at some point later. But we have a question at the outset, which is that if by deception, now I don't want to get into whole sort of analytical, philosophical sort of things about what constitutes a true statement or a lie. Let's just assume the old man on the mountain is right, the old Persian assassin is right, that everything is an illusion, including reality, including existence, but with no recourse to a kind of dialectical opposite. So we're in a dream from which there's no waking. We're in a hallucination from which there's no return to sobriety. We're in a state of madness for which there's no reversal into sanity. Right? There's only one world. There's no transcendence. And there's no alternative, but the world we're in is a hallucination itself. It's a smoke and mirrors universe. Now, without getting into all the logical argumentation around that, let's just fly with it. And the reason is because we have to answer a very dangerous question at the outset, which is why do figures who engage in creative deception, artists, philosophers, mystics, great sculptors, architects, musicians, why throughout history do members of our tribe keep getting killed? This is a very bloody history that we descend from. The very act that we're doing, I don't take it sort of casually. I take it playfully, because play to me is a lethal concept. But I know, I write about figures, and I've dealt with figures who have quite literally given their lives to write the things that they do. And so when we have a long history, whether on the east or western side, of imprisonment, exile, censorship, poverty, madness, alienation, execution, then we have to ask ourselves, why are their lies so threatening, and in what ways specifically do they threaten the real? And I can offer a quick sort of set of answers to that potentially, which is, just hold on one second here. First is that I think that deception, in the way that we're going to configure it, is antithetical to myth. Okay, and myths are what uphold the real. Mythic sort of archetypes and mythic substructures, right? How is deception a lie different than a myth? First of all, do many of you heard of George Bataille, and a figure who sort of convened a secret society? Also, he's a phenomenal writer and philosopher, but he also convened a secret society called Asafale. in the 20th century. And they were devoted particularly to exploring rituals and sacrifices. The ideas of ritual and sacrifice culminating supposedly, this is the alleged purpose, with a human sacrifice. And the reason that Bataille wanted to attempt that was he thought that through a human sacrifice, and he volunteered himself, according to the stories, he thought that that was the only way to generate a mythic countercurrent that was powerful enough to undo fascism. Right? So if fascism is based on extremely forceful, sort of almost primordial sort of myth making, he thought that it required a sacrificial figure who then could be spun into an idea, a whisper, an image that could take on mythic proportions that would be the antidote. I absolutely adore George Bataille, but I think that he's quite wrong on that. I don't think that a myth undoes a myth. I think a lie can kill a myth. And I want to distinguish that. You know, he was following this sort of logic of only a wolf can kill a wolf. So he thought only a myth can unravel a myth. But the lie does. And the reason for that is, and we'll just differentiate. First of all, here's the criterion. Myths are always about establishing origins, for the most part. The origin of a civilization, the origin of a people, of a race, of a tribe. Whereas lies erase origins. If you think of cult leaders, their first sort of obligation is to steal you from your family, society, and even your name. So the very first technique is to undo your connection to origin, right? And by the way, just since we're doing a seminar in deception here, two of the very special tricks of cult leaders, and please don't use these, right? I'm giving you weapons here that I don't want you to go out into the world and use, is one that they tell the new initiate that they're special. They differentiate them. They say, I see something in you, you know, everyone else is false, is artificial, is slave-like, but you see through it all. So they differentiate you and elevate you at some level, which plays to a kind of narcissistic quality. Everyone wants to feel that they're the chosen one. In fact, even this happens in the Matrix. This is how Morpheus communicates to Neo, right? And the second is that you have an unlocked, unforeseen potential that only the cult leader can perceive and help you fulfill. So that becomes your indebtedness. I see something in you. I still can't tell you about it, but if you stay with me, I'll help you find it. Right? So it's a gift. So really, it's a philosophy of differentiation and becoming, both of which require you to annihilate their origins. Right? Myths are also another way that myth and deception are differentiated, is that myths are about universal, or at least collective messages. Again, tribal, civilizational, imperial. Lies, though, are rare time capsules or music boxes that are designed just for a single listener. If you think of the way the devil approaches, the way evil is defined, evil is always a one-on-one encounter. God deals in universals, but the devil steals into your sort of inner quarters on one night, learns your particular sensitivities, your outlooks, your individual tastes, and refines a set of lies that suit only your sort of outlook and disposition. So that's another way in which lies and myths are different. But also another reason why poets, philosophers, artists, sculptors, dancers, and visionaries are killed throughout history is that I think deception is the single greatest weapon against ideology. This is why I take it very seriously that at the end of his life, Jean Baudrillard was claiming that the only concept that could have any currency in sabotaging the age of simulation or the age of capitalist modernity is not resistance and revolutionary sort of paradigms, but seduction. He thought that you needed to unlock the potentials of the great seducers in order to disabuse the ideologues. And that contestation is something that we'll explore here. We're going to look at his piece called Seduction as Destiny later in the seminar. But in what way is deception counter-ideological? Well, take for one thing the expression honor amongst thieves. You guys have heard of that expression? There's honor amongst thieves. Which means that there's an ethical code, strangely enough, in criminal undergrounds. And the ethical codes of criminality or thieves or liars is not based on identity or moral obligation, the way family is or social sort of identities are, but rather criminal functionality. So we're all going to rob a bank, right? Someone is the lock picker, someone is the lookout, someone is the getaway driver. Your intimacy with me, or your honor sort of code to me, is that you will be criminally functional in the moment of greatest urgency. you will do what you say you're going to do. You rise to the occasion and you execute your ability. So it's not based on names, it's not based on histories or lineage, it's based on pure ability, right? And particularized, specialized abilities. So that's the idea of honor amongst thieves. And there's something really intriguing about that to me. I'm sure all of you are aware that most people are absolutely terrible liars. And this is something that poker players, professional gamblers exploit very well. You know, if you ever play a professional poker player, they sit for the first hour and they just learn what are called your tells, which are sort of indicators of when you lie, when you're bluffing, when you have a good hand. And people are just a mess. If you ask them, they're absolutely horrible at concealment, right? You know, the other profession that exploits this tendency or this vulnerability exceptionally well, psychoanalysis, right? So great psychologists from Freud onwards know precisely how to read the places where you stutter, the places where you pause, the places where you look up and down, and they can create an alternative kind of cartography of when you're lying to yourself, right? Or when you're lying to the psychoanalyst. And they've made a hell of a lot of money over the past century just doing that parlor trick of being able to sort of read people's amateurish attempts to conceal themselves. There's another thing too. Probably the absolute worst performances of deception are if you ever watch local television commercials where people are representing their businesses. Some guy sells cars and all that, and he's essentially asked just to perform himself. He introduces, hi, I'm Bob, the owner of Ford dealership, and so they're awful. They're the most sort of painful things to watch. They're not elegant or eloquent at all, and they're performing themselves, ironically. So the question there is why? Why can't they sort of simulate themselves well? And there's a reason for that, which is that it goes back to ideology, and we'll talk about that in a second, which is that most people are terrible liars because those are lies of repression. And repression is always disheveled and inarticulate and terrible. We are not looking for that in this list. We're not interested in ideological lies, and we're not interested in repressive self-delusion. We're interested in enchantment. And so we're looking at sort of creative, diabolically self-aware figures who know what they're doing, know how to will things like a sorcerer does, right? So we're going to differentiate this. So I said the first thing is that actually deception has an ethical code. If I don't like the term ethics often, let's say an honor code, which ideology does not. And the other thing is that, again, ideology uses repression, whereas deception, if it's done by a true master, requires ultra awareness and vigilance. So if you want an example of that, here's another question. If people are terrible liars, why are con men, so-called con men, which stands for confidence men? Because they gain your confidence and then cheat you of your money, right? Or something like that. Why are they so exceptionally agile? Why are they so fluid? And if you take as an example of, and I can tell you why, it's because they have an honor code underlying their deceptions. Do you know what it is? Anyone just offhand? I mean, everything they're spinning, all their narratives are nonsensical. You know, I'm from this place, you know, I've done these things. But what's their underlying premise? Which I want to stray from using the word their truth. It's not their truth, but they have a kind of incantatory supposition. And that is that if circumstances were correct in the world, they would be where you are. They'd have your money, or they'd have your status. That it's only a matter of bad luck or circumstance. The con man tells themselves all the time, it's only bad luck or circumstantial conditions which makes you elevated in an unnatural social hierarchy. But they're quicker than you, they're more cunning than you, they're smarter than you, they can run circles around you, and so they deserve whatever's in your pocket or your bank account. They feel it's due to them in a natural hierarchy of things. Because of that, they can lie beautifully, because they're serving that higher purpose of a restoration of a world order. You follow? And in fact, there's probably no better example in literature than Gatsby for that. In American literature, the great Gatsby, he has these lavish parties. They're all just huge spectacles. They're fabricated spectacles, and you know he's not authentically an aristocrat. And yet, the greatest aristocrat in history, the one that everyone adores, is the performer, is the imposter, which is an amazing sort of thing. No authentic aristocrat could play an aristocrat as well as he does and become an object of adoration. But what's underlying his performativity, where he wears the best clothes and he sort of develops the best sort of extravaganzas, and everyone wants to be at his house and all that. He himself doesn't attend his parties. He is consumed by the green light across the water, which embodies to him his lost love, his passion, and all that. And he can lie through his teeth each evening, because at the end of the evening, at the end of the parties, when everybody vacates from that drunken sort of spree, he stands like a knight watching over that light, holding vigil. So again, there is a kind of honor code that I want us to get to within deception. There's also the expression thick as thieves, if you've heard that, right? And thick as thieves tells us that there's intimacy in deception and in criminality, obviously because you're in a state of danger or risk together. Also, survival makes it sort of a very important sort of thing. If you think of criminals who have to do something that's very dangerous. And then in the aftermath, there's always the ever-present possibility of betrayal. That if you and I are in a kind of criminal conspiracy, you can always expose me later. And so that creates a thickness which is unparalleled by any social media sort of linkages that we create, or the sort of the useless banality of friends sort of in those universes, right? Which are usually very low stakes and low intensity, right? So that's why I think liars actually have extreme intimacy. Another just quick set of things of how ideology and lies are opposed to one another. And this is precisely why people in political power, religious power, sort of structures of moral power in society, why they perceive artists as enemies or storytellers as enemies, is that ideologies are typically neurotic. The way we're going to define lies are that they're ecstatic by nature. Ideologies, again, are repressive. Lying requires extreme vulnerability and exposure, as well as diabolical awareness. That's why the devil makes you sign a contract. Right? Ideology is abstract and instrumental. It's always a means to an end, a means to wealth, a means to power, a means to image or status, versus lies, which are performative, which makes them visceral and sensorial. Ideology always tends to try and be universal and offer universality and permanence, whereas deception offers particularity and transience. We'll get into that. Ideology, again, is based in archetypes, usually cliches, of infinitely reproducible and interchangeable propaganda, whereas deception is based in prototypes, which means originality, things that can't be imitated or easily replicated, like meeting someone at a party who's unparalleled, someone that's like no one else you've ever met before, right? Conjuring that type of image. Ideology promises utopias, which are unifying endpoints, and so it's a narrative of arrival and of totality. Great liars offer you only a single night of improvisational movements. So you're always in the middle, to use a Deleuzian and Guattarian term, you're in the middle or you're in the drift. And instead of utopia, they offer you subterfuge. Subterfuge by etymology means to flee beneath. Means they offer you a way of escape, right? And so it's about, instead of about arrival or totality, it's about escape and desertion, as well as the infinite. And I mean infinite here in a very particular way. A close colleague and collaborator of mine, Dejan Lukic, gave a lecture once in which he said that everybody misses the ancient definition of infinite. Everybody thinks infinite means without finitude or beyond finitude or something of that nature. He actually says the most basic etymological reading of infinite is unfinished. Right? That the world is unfinished, that the game is unfinished. So whereas utopias try and offer sort of the finitude of a totality, a resolution of history, the liar offers you the rapture and the euphoria of an unfinished game, an unfinished process. That's like a children's drawing that's always under construction. That's a metaphor that Dejan Lukic uses. You know, it's not interested in being complete. And the last thing, and this is the final sort of way of differentiating, so you guys know what type of deceptions we'll be interested in charting and creating in this seminar experience, is that ideology always attempts to disenchant its listener. So it weakens them in terms of power, makes them slave-like or subordinate. Whereas deception, the way we're going to define it, is always about intensification. It enlivens, kind of in the Nietzschean sense of a will to power, It turns everything around itself into a sort of a inspired state. Now, there's only one problem with that ethically, which is that like a vampire's bite, it's an inflicted supremacy. So a great manipulator will make you, that evening when they have you in their sort of grasp, they'll make you smarter, more eloquent, more cunning, more sensitive than you've ever been before. And on your terms, not on their terms, if they're doing it right. Meaning they'll unlock all kinds of prisms of perception that are exclusive to your talents and your abilities. But it will be by force. Because the sad thing is that if a vampire asks people whether or not they want to get bitten, for all the rewards, vampires are a superior race. I mean, they're quicker, they're smarter, they're everything. They don't age, they have immortality, you know, they're more elegant sort of perceivers of existence. They can levitate, all sorts of things. They can read minds. Why wouldn't you want to be bitten? But 9 out of 10 people would say no. And that's precisely Nietzsche's diagnosis of the mediocrity of the human race, that it will choose its chains, you know, that it will choose its own oppression and sort of pathetic stasis. So the liar doesn't ask you whether or not you want to enter his story or her story. They just inflict that state of supremacy. The word to inspire etymologically means to breathe into. So there's a violence there. There's a kind of creative violence of possession almost. So we have, and that's only a problem for modern humanism. It's not a problem if you're an ancient sibyl or fortune teller who considers it a great gift to be chosen to be possessed by other forces, right? So we'll get into that. Our method for the seminar is going to be an intriguing one. We're going to chart as many techniques of deception and then as many theaters of operation for deception as possible. And that means looking into sort of molecular levels of different movements, narratives, gestures, times and spaces of deception, objects of deception, how the different body parts become intricately aligned in deception. And also conceptual figures that are aligned with deception, which we'll get into in a minute. So basically, we're not attempting to build a universal theory of deception, but rather, again, a kaleidoscopic and shape-shifting method. We're going to create a labyrinth of multiple deceptions, or a hall of distorting mirrors. You're going to see there are countless far-reaching categories, diagrams, mazes, but there's only one criterion, which is that lies, like spells, have to work. So there is no concept of an inherent philosophical or aesthetic value. That's art or that's thought. It's only does the right effective universe generate itself. You know, the ancient Aramaic expression abracadabra, like what magicians say. A lot of people don't know it's ancient Aramaic, which just means I create what I speak. Abracadabra, I create what I speak. There has to be that instantaneity and that efficacy of manifestation. If you can't incarnate a thought or an idea or an image or a speech act, then it's worthless in the deceptive sphere, which means we have to be attuned to the outside constantly and to the creative object's impact on the outside. So it's kind of a philosophy of ricochets and waves that we're going to look into. Very quickly then, as quick as we can get into this, I'm going to share a screen with you now, and then we'll do intros after that, which, you know, I don't have a sadistic bone in my body. I consider this a masochistic thing to do to all of you, but basically I like to bombard on the first session. We're not going to take things slow and be contemplative. I'm going to assault you with a kind of excess of possibilities here. So can all of you see these? Everybody's good to see can you see the screen?
Perfect, Jason.
Yes.
Excellent, thank you. So these are deceptive sub-concepts, which we'll get into. Obviously, deception means you have to be pretty good at manipulation, which requires concepts of mastery, craft, and artifice. Distortion, riddles, encryptions, stealth, seduction, which has to do with style and immersion. Desire, attraction, and repulsion. That's a hell of a trick, by the way, to be hideous and irresistible. That's something that some beat poets and certain decadent poets understood. That's also something that piracy understands. Pirates are figures who make attractive forces out of their deformities and their defects, right? So the more scarred you are, the eye patch, the hook, the leg, the wooden leg, all of these supposed defects become part of a universe of charisma and charismatic power in certain realms of criminality and piracy. So we'll get into that. Attraction and repulsion. Intelligence, again, diabolical perception, which gets us into questions of evil as well. Enchantment, intensity, awe, projection. Unknowing, that's a great mystical concept. How to enter into states of disorientation or forgetting. Nietzsche has a beautiful line that that always guides me. He says, the artist is the one who forgets everything in order to do just one thing. One can hold that same definition for the liar, that they have to create states of oblivion in order to project one sort of idea often. Imagination, intimacy, betrayal, play, guile, violation, subtlety, secrecy, allure, and the etymology of secrecy is secretion. Ancients are so much smarter than we are. They recognize something, which is that the very essence of a secret is to leak. That they're the inevitable sort of exposure of them. So it's built into the etymology. Subterfuge, which is about procedures. Insinuation, that's a great term that I like. One of the, again, I hate to arm all of you with these bad weapons. They're malevolent weapons. But one great deceptive sort of trick is if you ever wanted to make someone very anxious and self-conscious, you meet them at a party, you haven't seen them for a long while, you drop a kind of casual observation. It's like, hey, I haven't seen you. I never noticed in the past how close your eyes are together. That's kind of strange. Anyway, good to see you, and you leave, right? If you say it maliciously, right, they'll immediately dismiss it. They'll dismiss it as your moral failure, that you're a cruel being or that you have an ill intent. But if you say it in passing, right, that it's just sort of a trivial observation, then they run into the bathroom and they look in the mirror and they start looking at their eyes. This is why, again, the greatest sort of fear in the history of ideology, but also certain strands of philosophy are afraid of this figure, are children, madmen, and fools, because they say what they see. They just blurt it out. They have no censor in that regard. So that's part of it. Insinuation. Proximity and distance is going to be a really crucial thing. If you're a great cult leader, if you're the old man on the mountain, and you have a host of assassins who you're training who all sort of worship this charismatic figure of you, you want to have certain nights where you invite certain practitioners to come and walk with you in the courtyards, where you reveal to them very specialized things. But you have to make it a very short experience. You know why? Why don't you stay for 7 hours speaking with your follower? Because every sort of time that you add to it exponentially magnifies the possibility of imperfection. You can trip while walking, you can cough and start choking, all of which sort of ruins your elevation. You follow? So it has to be fast so you can get out in time and leave the impression of your force, of your perfection. It's just you multiply the possibility of falling from grace or becoming disenchanted in the eyes of the world. So distance is a very important thing. Of course, the greatest manipulator of distance as a form of seduction is God, right? Sort of the idea of the being who withdraws and magnifies their power through withdrawal. That's actually more of an Islamic concept than a Judeo-Christian concept, but it's there in all monotheism. We get into impossibility and miracle. That's going to be fun when we start talking about miracle. Again, how deception relates to language, persuasion, influence, rumor, extortion, consciousness, curiosity, intuition, interruption. That's a very crucial thing. Deleuze has a piece called He Stuttered, which is a critical small thing, and he's thinking of Antonin Artaud when he writes it, that Artaud has a stuttering mechanism in his schizophrenic rants. And there's something crucial to that, because the stutter tells you, unless it's a kind of just a physiological defect of someone who's sort of born with a stutter, the stutter in writing for Deleuze tells you that they could have gone elsewhere. You follow that split-second pause or delay, that lapse tells you that the author could have taken an alternative trajectory, which if you do your job, then you should be wondering not about what they're saying, but about what they're concealing at that point, where they didn't go, right? And that's kind of again, the idea of the magician who raises their left hand up here so they can do the trick with the right hand. imperceptibly. So interruption, at what point do you create diversions in your speech? You can think about a liar who's in the midst of a narrative or a story. At what point do they divert, digress, twitch, stutter, pause? We can think of dramatic pausing. Entrancement, when we deal with shamanic figures and mystical figures who know how to create enclosures of delirium, that's going to be a form of deception that's very powerful. And you know, it's a great thing to me. Rationalists always take shots at mystics by saying, and I don't mean sort of your sorry, no offense to anyone, but your sort of LA Sunday from 3 to 4, go to yoga mystic, your part-time new age mystic. I mean old school, real deal, 24/7 in the Shaolin temple or in the Sufi sort of, you know, mountains and all that, or wandering sort of the earth. Those rogue figures are forces to be reckoned with. And whether or not their abilities, walking on coals, sleeping on nails, putting blades through their body, things I've seen actually up close, whether they're psychosomatic or not, who cares? That in fact makes it more interesting. If it's completely psychosomatic and there's absolutely no sort of transcendent power that there is, that to me is actually more powerful. And we have to sort of understand what levels of mind or of mindlessness they're approaching that enable these almost superhuman sort of abilities. So that's something for us to look at. Infatuation, intrigue, fixation, captivation, obsession, how you create levels of that. Self-destruction is a part of that, how you unravel. Transformation, vulnerability, subversion, concealment. You know, there are something like 27 words in both Arabic and Persian for conceal. And because there are many methodologies of concealment. So we'll look into that: masking, disguise, dissimulation, camouflage, unveiling, complexity, confusion, appearance, disappearance, and conjuration. At the end of his life, Baudrillard had a short essay that very few people read called "Why Hasn't the World Already Disappeared?" It's something that we'll consider as well. And then the last thing, again, conjuration, is how to enter states of pretending, costume, or masquerade. So if you thought that wasn't sort of intricate enough, we've got more levels to deal with. And I'll just go through these quickly here as much as I can. There are lies that you tell specifically in states of death, war, love, dream, and game. Even better, if we really want to get complex, what kind of lies does someone tell who believes, and now this is where we transverse the concepts here, who believes that death is a matter of war, who believes that death is a force of love, who believes that death is a dream or death is a game? What kind of lies does someone tell who believes war is about death, war is about love, dream, or game? Someone who thinks love is death, thinks love is war, love is dream, or love is game. Someone who thinks their dreams are a matter of death, war, love, or game. These, when you start putting these combinations together, you get highly specialized and refined versions of deception that emerge, depending on which concept binds the other concepts. But at any rate, there are lies of status. Those are the ones that make you the ruler or the icon, versus lies of wretchedness. It's a very interesting thing. There are certain lies you would only believe and go along with if you're someone powerful in the sort of the social hierarchy. Then there are lies that you would only believe if someone is an ascetic or an outcast. Their entire legitimacy or credibility comes from them being at the abject levels, the 0 degree of social hierarchies. There are lies that are based on tone, aggression, lightness, mockery, indifference, deviance, by the way, and by that I mean people who sell you things in the mouth of alleyways, right? The dealer. The dealer is an expert in tonality. First, you can picture them when they're standing there. Are they, in terms of posture, are they urgent or are they relaxed? Almost always relaxed, leaning against the wall, right? As if to say, you need me more than I need you. But also, what are they projecting? That this is inevitable, this is a done deal, because this is an innate desire of yours. What I want or what I sell is something you want. And it's an unstoppable sort of event that's going to transpire. Maybe not tonight, maybe you have to summon the courage by going by 3 times. But eventually, right, the odds are in my favor. They also mock people when they walk by. If you ever read Freud's The Uncanny, it's inspired by the fact that he found himself wandering through the red light district unconsciously, right? In case you don't know. And who absolutely picked up on that immediately? The prostitutes. And they started mocking him, calling him out, right? And he ran away because he's a kind of conservative, middle class, European at the time. He runs from the alleyways. But then he realizes something, that their performativity was exposing certain things. Also, a very crucial thing is when the liar uses indifference. You know that it's even taught at real estate conventions that at some point when you're trying to close a deal about a house, you should do this gesture, meaning my hands are off. Look, I'm not pushing you. I'm not trying to insist. If you want to go see more houses, we can. I think this is the one, but it's your call. They teach that to him. It's part of the capitalist matrix of deception to feign indifference as the seller, right? And then there's lies that are based on rhythm, manipulations of speech, of breath, of narrative. There are lies of voice, volume, when do you lower and sort of, and when do you heighten your tone, emphasis, do you want to be extremely eloquent or mystifyingly silent? Lies of posture, again, relaxed or intense. Lies of gesture, signals. Lies of appearance, working on your dress, your gaze, your accessory, your style. Right? This is something that Nietzsche said the most dangerous concept that philosophy never wants to deal with is style. And that's his shot at Hegel too, right? That the two unforgivable crimes of Hegel have nothing to do with his content, even though he despises that too. He says that the greatest crimes of Hegel are one, that he has no style, and two, that he takes no pleasure in his work. Both of which are criteria of the liar, of deception. Style and taking pleasure, right? So we get into that. Lies of instrumentalism, we're going to avoid that more. Those are it's a means to an end, versus pathological lying, which is just you're doing it for the rush or the sensation. You lie because you like lying, versus aesthetic lying, which is based on craft, which we'll get into. Lies of neurotic desire, that's for power, belonging, beauty, preservation. Notice that when genies appear in sort of fictions, usually Orientalist fictions of the Middle East, when a genie appears and grants wishes, usually they're neurotic wishes that are the first that come to mind. Someone wants to be a king, someone wants to have palaces and all of that. But then there are lies of ecstatic risk, which are lies of adventure. If you read Goethe's Faust, the first deal with the devil that he makes in there is to just see things he's never seen before. Witches, bonfires on top of mountains, undersea creatures, all sorts of things like that. So those are two differentiations as well. Lies of specificity, which means lies that are about one thing versus lies of vagueness, about the unknown. Lies of simplicity, one-dimensional lies, versus lies of intricacy, where you have to layer upon layer. Lies of formality, which require hierarchy, sanctity, jargon. Those are usually the stories that you see in religion again, versus lies of informality. When does the liar use humor, slang, or vulgarity? Interestingly, lies of youth to elders. When do young people lie to old people, right? And that's often in cases of fraud. Again, con men tend to predatorily go from young, exploiting the old, right? Their loneliness or their gullibility at some level, or their technological sort of defects. That's the white collar crime of those emails that get sent out to you, telling you that they're going to place money in your bank account, and you just have to give your account number. Disproportionately, almost 90% of the people who ever answer those are elderly. In case you're unaware of that, I read sometimes FBI things, don't ask why, and I find that stuff out. So where were we at? Youth to elders versus lies of elders to youth, and that's predatory abuse. What are the kinds of lies that the kidnapper tells? Right. Also, overprotective parents. What are the lies that they tell to their children, right, to insulate them from the world? So there are all sorts of things like that. There's lies of enticement, which are about temptation. Lies of inhibition, based on fear. Lies of provocation, which incense you, make you angry. Often gossip tries to do that, by the way, which Freud spoke of gossip as a kind of sympathetic killing, sympathetic magical killing of the other, right? It's a death wish. So you're trying to get someone else to share your malediction, your evil invocation against them. There's lies to the collective. That's awesome if we start looking at mass hysteria, right? Sort of, it's a cool concept. Under what particular circumstances does a crowd hallucinate? It's a very rare occurrence, but it has a certain dynamic that we can actually explore and decipher, right? And it happens even. There are pilgrimages where people believe they see the same thing sort of appear in the sky. So where was that? Lies to the collective versus lies to the individual. Lies that would only work one-on-one. That's particularity. Lies of rare opportunity. Oh, you better do this now, otherwise it's your last chance. Versus lies of indefinite potential, which are, don't worry, this is always open to you. Lies of denial versus distraction versus intrigue. Lies of invention, that's where you fabricate something, versus exaggeration, so you make something seem bigger than it is. Diminution, so you make something smaller than it is. Think of the beginning of Alice in Wonderland. Her first task that she has to master to enter Wonderland is to master proportion. Right? She has to be small enough or big enough to get through the keyhole. Right? And she's got, I think, a mushroom and a bottle of water that she has to partake of in order to figure out the balance. Well, the liar has to do that as well. To enter Wonderland, or a state of pretending, you have to know what to exaggerate and what to slight or diminish. Great miniaturist artists from Persian traditions and other traditions know about this, right? The miniaturization of forms. It's an extremely powerful gesture. Versus omission, and those are lies where you're hiding certain details. Kafka is exceptional about that, by the way. I don't want to give away all his tricks, but as someone who studied him for decades, I can tell you that part of what creates the Kafkaesque atmosphere, what we call the Kafkaesque, which is that eerie temperature, and I always say this, do you know how damn good you have to be as an author to have a type of air named after you? It's remarkable that they named the Kafkaesque. It's a certain, again, moodscape that when you enter a room, you say, it feels Kafkaesque in here. That means he knows exactly what he's doing, and like an alchemist, he knows the perfect dosage and balance in order to orchestrate that feeling, that weirdness, that strangeness. And the way he does that is often by giving you something and taking it back. So Kafka's great line in the Blue Octavo notebooks, which we're going to read, where he says, there is infinite hope, comma, but not for us. Or when he says something like, dread of night, comma, dread of not night. You go, what the hell is that? Or in the middle of his notebooks, he writes, today an epileptic girl drowned in the well. And this detail, which is a highly precise sort of configuration of vivid details, a little girl, an epileptic, a well, drowning, nevertheless opens up more pathways to obscurity. It opens more questions than answers, right? And this is part of Kafka's methodology. You know, do you know the girl? Did you witness it yourself? Did you read about it? Did you dream it? Did someone push her? Was it accidental? Was it suicidal? You know, there's all kinds of questions that unfold. He knows precisely how much to tell you that it makes you more perplexed and more bewildered. And that's his methodology. Often you see, even as a narrator, he's the most ominously deceptive narrator in that it's a vanishing horizon of familiarity with the author. You know the author better on page 3 than on page 37. He's fading from you. He's becoming more vague and more mystified. And then at some points, even in his narratives, he just leaves you. It's almost like an operator or an automatic voice that continues very metallically, but Kafka's not there anymore. And he kind of turns to you before he does that, if you read him very subtly, and he'll say almost to his reader, why did you even trust me to begin with? Who says I was on your side or I was supposed to guide you? Why'd you even walk into the forest with me? I'm going to leave you here now. And he does. So this is the great deceptive writer that we're going to look at. Kafka will be central at one point for us. Lies of utopia versus dystopia. So we got your doomsday prophets versus your revolutionary leaders. Lies of reward. And we can get into this. Lies that offer promises, vows, debts, gifts, offers, proposals versus punishment. Lies that threaten you. Lies of the fantastical, fairy tales, carnivals, freak shows, bestiaries. We'll look at a medieval bestiary, a great Islamic medieval bestiary, where it's just all these sort of fictive creatures that are created versus hyper-realist lies. And that's shock image, oftentimes, something that's too real. Lies of play, and this is have any of you ever heard of Roger Calois's book? I think it's called Man, Games, Play. It's an obscure work by Calois, who was in the secret society with Bataille. He's an absolutely fascinating figure. And basically, he divides play. He watched children's gameplay, and he noticed that, fascinatingly, children play almost instinctively. They don't do any of the other things instinctively. They don't go to school instinctively. They don't, eat dinner instinctively. They don't obey rules instinctively, but they play games. They play instinctively without any adult supervision or any adult guidance. And one thing that he noticed is that they almost intuitively always have rules to their games. They know that the thrill of the game is lost if it's too chaotically open-ended, right? If it's too formless. Now, also they understand how to cheat rules, although children are more ethical about getting angry when people cheat than adults. But the four categories or typologies of play that Calois deciphers is brilliant are what he calls agon, which are games of skill. And so that's something like chess or archery, where it's almost 100% skill-based. Then there are games of chance, and that's like the lottery or slot machines, right? There's a third category he doesn't quite mention, but there are many games, particularly most gambling, is actually a mixture of both skill and chance. Agon and Alea, which is the second one, chance. So you have, so for instance, if you think of blackjack or if you think of poker, the cards matter, but also your skill matters. So it's a kind of hybrid. Backgammon is another game that also has that mixture of chance and skill. The third are role-playing games. That's when kids sort of do pretend and they sort of play at different, I'm a princess, you're a prince, or I'm a dragon and you're this or whatever. So those are games of he calls them mimesis. And then there are games he calls ilingic games, ilinx, which comes from the Greek word whirlpool, which he says are basically just about sensation. And that's something like bungee jumping, right? Or skydiving, roller coasters. There's no real win or loss or sort of objective to the game other than the sensation itself. And he says the most rudimentary form of that is when the kid spins around in a circle and then falls down on the ground dizzy. And they're just doing it for the sensation. So it's a form of play, but it's just a sensorial form, purely sensorial. And we still have those sort of into adulthood. But then I added a fifth category, which he doesn't mention, which are games of sabotage or intentional loss. So there are games that only kids like, which are like demolition. That's like building sandcastles close to the waves, precisely so that they can be washed away. Or when you spend 4 hours with a child building a city out of blocks, and then they, Godzilla the whole thing, and they sort of, stomp all over and trample it, and you look at it as a waste of productive time, but they say the whole point was the exhilaration of destroying that world, ultimately. Also, there are games where all the pleasure is in losing. So hide and seek is one of them. The person who takes the most sort of ecstatic gain from the game of hide and seek is the one who's found, the one who loses, precisely at the moment when they lose. Tag is also that way. When someone's chasing after you, the one who gets caught gets the rush in the chest. The one who wins, meaning the one who tags you or the one who finds you in hide and seek, they experience a sense of kind of abstract accomplishment, which is more a release from pain, right? So finally they're off the hook, they got you, the game can end. But the other one actually giggles in the closet the whole time while they're being found out. Does that make sense? So there are those games of intentional loss. And by the way, there are great poets who write about that. Of Ahmad Shamlu, the great Iranian sort of prison poet, once said, "I would only fight wars I was destined to lose." So it's a great articulation. So we'll get into that. Lies of intentional self-delusion. That's where you believe your own lies. When you hype yourself into a state where you actually fall into kind of the whirlwind of your own deceptions. Novalis has a quote about this where he says, the greatest liar and manipulator would be the one who could bring themselves to tears from the telling of their own lies. So that's something for us to consider. Again, there are malicious lies, social lies, entrancing lies, lies of familiarity. That's where your only lies that would work if you're already intimate with a person, versus lies of anonymity, things that only the stranger can tell you. And again, that psychoanalysis exploits that. They can lie to you with all their kind of black magic sort of configurations and their diagnoses, only because they're presumably an objective, impartial stranger. You follow? So if they were known, you wouldn't tell the same things, then they wouldn't tell the same things to you. Lies of miraculous illusion versus concealable lies, collaborative lying, where you lie together, versus solitary lying, lies of a superior versus lies of the inferior, false messengers, this people of whisper, gossip, rumor, lies that return to old myths versus new lies, which are about surprise and novelty, lies of adolescent development. Real quick, I've written this elsewhere, that there are essentially 4 stages of lying, of deception that children get initiated into. The first lie is the lie of pretending, which is the innocent lie of just playing, right? Again, pretending that there's something they're not. The second lie, which they learn to develop, is denial. So that's when they become conscious enough of the rules of the game of reality that they color all over the walls with their crayons, and the parent comes in and an authoritarian voice says, "Who did this?" And they say, "It wasn't me." So that's usually the second sort of stage of deceptive development. The third is self-aggrandizement. That's the teenager who lies that they're dating someone at another school, you know, and who they're actually not, and sort of they're making up sort of lies of exaggeration to make themselves seem cooler than they are. And finally, you have lies of cruelty, and that's sadistic lies, which is the, for lack of a, I'll generalize here, but the underlying sort of substructure of society itself. There's spite, hatred, malevolence in social interaction, because it's considered a cutthroat zero-sum game. If you're doing well, I'm not doing well. So that's how economy functions, that's how status functions, and that's how religion functions, even between the chosen and the damned. And it's how politics functions with all of its hierarchies and ranks. If someone's the general, then I'm not the general. If someone's the president, then I'm not the president. And so that's where lies suddenly twist. Those are the least interesting to me. We're going to try and reverse the scales and go back to pretending more. Lies that grant you entrance into something, a lie that gets you into a club versus lies that get you out of something. Illusion and circumvention. Lies of nature, we can get into that. You know, all natural forces have deception built into them, natural spaces too, geographical spaces. The forest lies in terms of mist, fog, there are pits in the forest, there are all kinds of fragile branches beneath your feet. Deserts lie in terms of teasing you with breezes, mirages, all sort of complex assortments of things, as well as, very fascinatingly, the infinitely irritating nature of sand, which gets in everything. If you ever want to read a great novel of the 20th century, you have Woman in the Dunes by Kobo Abe, absolutely phenomenal work, where this guy gets trapped in the sand dunes in some rural village in the outskirts of Japan. And he talks about the surprise with which he realizes sand gets into the corner of your eye, gets in the tongue. Everything he eats has sand in it because he's there. And so it becomes this sort of also deceptive force that imperceptibly invades upon you. The ocean deceives with the calm before the storm, with its tides that pull you in and you don't know that they're pulling you in, as well as the kind of inconceivable creatures that are beneath the surface. You know, like the octopus has an ancient form of intelligence that is indecipherable to us, as well as all kinds of other things. Caves lie about what inhabitants they have. Jungles lie in terms of camouflaging creatures, as well as all sorts of other things, quicksand. So we can get into that. Versus lies of divinities, you know, gods lie. They're trickster gods, demons lie. Angels are hermaphroditic by most definition, which means that they have kind of an unassignable physiology. And then the stars and omens lie all the time as well. And then there's lies of animalities, so biomimicry and camouflage. There are certain types of animals. We'll learn from this. We need to study actually all of these different configurations. Animals that lie in idleness because they want to pounce all of a sudden. Animals that shed skin or shed organs and can reproduce them. That's a form of deceptive modality if you think about it as well. So spiders, scorpions, all kinds of other things. A very crucial thing, you know, at the end of his life, Heidegger, who for most of his life doesn't interest me, to be quite honest with you, no offense to anyone who's a huge fan. I understand why, he's a genius, but just not my flavor. But at the end of his life, Heidegger said something quite compelling. He said that Nietzsche said that the one undiscovered concept of philosophy that has not been given attention is climate, or actually he said more specifically weather. He said philosophers don't think about weather, but it matters what's happening in the atmosphere around you. It matters if it's raining. It matters if there are storms. Thoughts shift subtly in one direction or another. He didn't give all of his credit to his own inherent interior genius. He thought, well, if there's lightning in the sky, my thoughts will trail in certain directions and start to flash accordingly. Philosophy has been, for the most part, under a kind of delusion of insularity ever since Plato, one could say in a lot of ways, of thinking that it's a purely interior process mind and all that obviously has been disabused more recently. But at the end of his life, Heidegger said mood is the greatest untapped concept for philosophy, and perhaps the most dangerous. And so we're going to look at writers of pure mood. Kafka is one of them, but there are many others. The first one we're going to deal with in this class, Sadr Hidayat, we're going to read The Blind Owl, which is, for those who may have read it before, Nima, I don't know if you've read it, or Dana, I don't know if you've read it. It's absolutely phenomenal. It's pure mood, and it's crafted like a perfect mosaic. Every line, like a spell, does what it's supposed to do, and it works. So we'll look at writers of mood. Lies of self-training, that's where it's an interesting thing that, certain psychoanalysts said, why do we, if the first job of the ego is self-preservation, survival, then why does it throw us nightmares? It seems to work against us sometimes, unless we understand the nightmare as a training ground, because it's basically the ego telling you that you're too weak right now. You need some practice. You need further muscularity, sort of, to you. So that's one way of understanding certain types of lies, that they train you. And then there's lies of elevation, euphemism, metaphor, idealization versus lies of degradation and addiction. Just quickly, the only last one that I want to get to quickly today is, this is our cast of characters. Sort of another way of understanding deception is through very precise conceptual figures. And so we've got the liar, the charlatan, trickster, cheater, imposter, heretic. All of these mean slightly different things. Obviously, if you take even the English language, it has almost endless words for destruction. Devastation, desolation, annihilation, eradication, cancellation, ruination, abolition, right? And just one after another, obliteration. And then you can get even to further subsets: slaughter, wreckage, carnage, disaster, catastrophe, right? And so there's a reason for it. It's because each of those are rungs of a ladder that do slightly different things. They have slightly different origins. They have slightly different effects. They have different atmospheres. So devastation etymologically carries the word vast in it, which means that the criterion for something to be devastating is that it must stretch and cover ground, an immensity of space. Desolation has sol in it, as in like soledad or solitude, which means that it has to leave things in a state of aloneness. Right? Those are very different definitional criteria. So similarly, each one of these figures, a charlatan is not quite a trickster, is not quite a cheater, imposter, heretic, the alchemist, saboteur, storyteller, occultist, seducer, prostitute or courtesan, con man, criminal, hustler, spy. By the way, we'll look at the language of espionage here too at some point. I'll let you guys in on the sort of the black box of spy terminology and what those codes mean. The mad woman, the actor, the artist, the poet, ringleader, hypnotist, gambler, perjurer, forger, fugitive, costume maker, conspirator, coder, riddler or the sphinx, the propagandist, the false god, the piper, siren, predator or prey, deviant and dealer, game master, escape artist, fortune teller, smuggler, pirate, mystic, mirror image, the puppet master. I think I had that already somewhere. The traitor, the prodigal, that's the oath breaker. The rogue, that's the figure of disgrace. The hypocrite, figure of duplicity. The villain, it's your nemesis, figure of spite. The seer, shaman, or astrologer. The samira, which is a great Arabic term for an evening conversationalist, always feminine. The poet of the tribe was almost, this is pre-Islamic Arabia, was all in nomadic tribes. The poet was almost always masculine. The naqal or the storyteller was almost always masculine, but the samira, which is the evening conversationalist, and that's a woman who would just stay up with you until 3, 4 in the morning on these insomniac nights or these nights of festival and just tell you things, and be an interlocutor. Shahrazad in the Arabian Nights is a samira figure in that regard. And then you have the eavesdropper. So each one of these throws us into different matrices that are very complex unto themselves. All right, I think, oh yeah, sorry, I'll just throw this one last one at you here. One last diagram. Spaces, you've got card tables, masquerades, there's spaces of deception, interrogation rooms, sideshows, freak shows, carnivals, circuses, the stage, the labyrinth, the opium den, the alley, the spectacle, the spiderweb, the trap door. We'll look at false architecture. It's no joke when Gaudi, and obviously he's become kind of a cliched and abused architectural figure, but when he built staircases that go into the ceiling, sort of non-functional architecture, that's a breakthrough in the history of representation. Pirate havens and criminal undergrounds, objects of deception, the mask, the veil, the distorting mirror, the magnifying glass, the crystal ball, the box, the capsule, the cosmetic or costume, the screen, the decoy, the robe, staff, or wand of the magician, the vial, the talisman, the improvised weapon. You know, in the history of Kung Fu, it's an amazing thing when people were deprived in the rural areas of actual weaponry. You weren't allowed to carry blades because the emperors feared rebellion. That's when Kung Fu had to design war through all kinds of everyday objects. So that's why there are forms in Kung Fu that use the flute or the fan or the spoon. There are all sorts of things, the pipe, you know, and so that's something we'll look into. The trap, net, or pit, those are the deceptive sort of apparatuses of the hunter, and the hook. A lot of people don't know this, but George Bataille in his book Guilty, which is for me one of his most phenomenal works and underread works. In Guilty, he keeps coming back to this thematic territory of the hook. He's very intrigued by the idea of the hook. Hedayat will also, in The Blind Owl, which we'll read for next week, speaks of being suspended by a slender hook in the back of his neck. That he has this feeling that he would be free falling through a kind of metaphysical nothing unless for that hook. And it's related in Bataille to death and chance, sort of to be caught on the hook. But at any rate, in the body parts, obviously the eyes and eyebrows and eyelashes are things that we can deceive with the smile, the mouth and the lips, the hands and the fingers, the fist or the chest. You think of the way that fighters or warriors use the chest, sort of as well as all kinds of costumes. Now in the modern era, we've turned it into the uniform. But if you think of tribal warfare, the cosmetics that they would apply to themselves before war, wearing animal furs, right? And things like that. Barbarians were great deceivers, self-deceivers, because it riles you up. You know, I mean, that's something we can even get into. If you look at the four figures in military history, the four conquerors in military history who are always known to fight unconditionally at the front lines of their military forces. Can anybody name them offhand? Always first at war, which is a rarity. Most kings stay in the back, most emperors watch from a distance. Do I have to unlock that for somebody to say something? Very cool. Go ahead and let someone, if you can. Their mic.
I don't know if anybody wants to chip in to...
It's an easy one. Go back. All right, go back to the spoiled brat from Macedonia, from the ancient world. Conquered the whole world at 18.
Alexander the Great.
There you go. You got Alexander the Great, always first. Okay, flash forward to the medieval era, coming from the Mongolian heights, leader of the hordes. Who's that?
Genghis Khan.
Genghis Khan, always at the forefront. By the way, do you guys know how Genghis Khan's warriors survived? Since he was never really interested in plunder or amassing riches the way that most conquerors do. He was most of the time his forces were starving. They would cut a small slit into the legs of their horses and drink the blood of their horses as they went from place to place. Okay, third, Iranians in the room, you got to know him. The mad king who poked out his own son's eyes in a paranoiac rage. Oh, come on, no one brainwashed you with good monarchist stories. Nader Shah. Nader Shah always at the forefront of his armies. And finally, 19th century. Couldn't stand to be in exile for too long. Little man complex. Come on, you know this one.
Napoleon?
Napoleon.
There you go. Napoleon, always at the forefront. Shot off of 37 horses in battle. That's a hell of a record, no? To be shot off of 37, to be go flying in the air 37 times. Interesting question. Shouldn't these people have died just by any probability theory? Multiple times over. Why did they endure? They all share one thing in common. A delusion of invincibility. And we have to ask a very practical existential question. Does believing you can't die enhance your probability on a battlefield that you won't die? Absolutely. Absolutely. That's why I take lies very seriously. Okay? So, cool. And then we've got the animal with their teeth, and the hips of the dancer, and we've got the athlete who stutter steps. Cool. Now is the time for Federico to guide us in introductions. except I'd like to change the rules of the game a little bit. Rather than the typical kind of neurotic self-presentation of an academic history of I'm studying this and that at this place and everything. We'll get into that at some point. I'm happy to learn those things about you. But they're usually dreaded by the people who say them, and they're all about establishing legitimacy and significance, and the tone is just bad. So how about this? It would be very cool if you could introduce yourselves to me via one singular feature, whether it's an experience or a tendency or an ability. You know, somebody descends from a salt desert where there's lots of scorpions. Someone is double jointed in both arms. Someone collects antique clocks from the ancient world. Figure out that one single point of fascination. If you had to say one thing about yourself, that is a rarity. And I'll stop sharing.
Okay, so if you want, Jason, I'm going to choose the victims at my own choosing. We'll start first with Nima. I think you're muted. We didn't hear you.
Okay. Okay, can you hear me now?
Perfect.
What can I say? I was saying maybe escaping some kind of formal establishment of some kind of genre that I feel comfortable with, maybe jumping out of that comfort zone all the time.
Excellent. Is this in music or is this in?
Mostly music.
Excellent. Cool.
Perfect. Thank you. So we'll now go to Damon Bonari.
Yeah. Hi.
Hello.
My mic is on. Yeah. Well, that's a intriguing question to be asked to describe myself with one feature, but I would summarize it in the terms of exotic storyteller, because I'm bound to spend a lot of time with my colleagues because of my work, and as an Iranian in Germany, I am, and especially in an seemingly orthodox work atmosphere in where I work, I have the advantage of being the person, the outsider, the Oriental exotic outsider, and I'm able to forge stories for them from my land, from Iran, from my last experiences. So storyteller, I would say.
Excellent. And I love that you say it's an advantage to be the outsider in that regard. Definitely. And you should lie through your teeth. In fact, I think it's more ethical than trying to tell the truth. Because one, who's entitled to answers or explanations of where you come from? And two, even if you did explain, who says they would ever understand? You know, we're caught in a state of incomprehensibility.
That's mostly the case, yeah.
Right. So good for you. You should just make Iran a more beautiful fiction than it actually is, sort of, and elegantly distorted.
Yeah, and interestingly, the current political turmoil of Iran nowadays gives a little more material.
That's right.
just to play with.
Good. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. So we'll now go to Jonathan.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, I'm Jonathan. So single defining feature. I think so being Salvadoran and being a kind of border crossing child criminal, I think has been pretty kind of a big part of my identity as an artist, professional, academic. I came to the States when I was 6. I came here with a coyote. So I think I was very fascinated and indoctrinated into this like consciousness of espionage. You know, we were given fake names as kids, and so this really took a I don't know, kind of like fantastical proportions growing up. So I would say it's that and kind of sort of tracing a kind of origin back to sort of ancestral third world tropical histories.
Wonderful, wonderful. You know, just quickly to that. Child gangs and child criminals are forces to be reckoned with. You don't never want to underestimate them. They use their smallness to their advantage. They also use their presumed innocence very well. I'm sure you know. So
I still use that.
It's not to diminish the actual lived brutality also of the conditions often of the child criminal who lives in the streets or who's orphaned. But you know, if I know this from traveling in Eastern Europe and in North Africa, if you see 5 kids coming at you, I fear that far more than the guy in the alleyway. You know, they're slippery and they're wonderful creatures, and they have their own arsenal based in their smallness and in their subtlety and their ability to vanish quickly, which is something that insects and reptiles and rodents also can do. They can go through walls, they can get into spaces that others can't. So that's awesome. Very good. Who else has got a rare singularity of some kind?
If you want, we can go to Kamangi.
Yeah, Kamangi. I guess I'll go with Mau Mau. I'm from Nairobi, Kenya. Yeah, Mau Mau was in radical movements of colonial fighters.
Cool.
Yeah.
Tell me more. You have a little more to tell about that?
Recently I came across these Mau Mau writings that were not maybe public domain before. We weren't taught in primary school and high school also. So yeah.
Excellent. Well, we can hopefully come back to that at some point too. Sounds fascinating.
Okay, so we can go then to Rafael.
Hey, hello. I'm Rafael. I'm Brazilian. And I guess that I would say that one of my best qualities is that I'm a very good listener. I don't know why, but I always like, if somebody tells me something, I remember it like for a lot of time. And like when I see that person, I can pull the whole history that I made of that person into my head. And it always like, I don't know, it sometimes tricks people onto things because it's unexpected for them most of the times. I'm good at picking details and this kind of stuff.
That is an exceptional skill set. Yeah, you should keep that because it's instant trust that builds. You know, and in order it's an interesting sort of philosophy of betrayal. To be a great traitor, to be able to betray someone's sensibilities, you first have to have trust. I mean, you can violate someone as a stranger, but you can only betray them when there's intimacy. And so, not that I'm saying you should betray these people around you. I'm just saying that betray in the creative sense of, you know, exposing them to alternative possibilities or breaking certain structures of the mind in conversations. Yeah, for you to pull out some coin or some token, an artifact of a conversation that they thought was lost in time and irrelevant. You know, it's the issue that we also have, the kind of ominous thing about scavengers and junk collectors. When you see someone sort of a street vagrant who's compiled things that in the capitalist sort of age we've discarded and we've relegated to the realm of waste, but they have created sort of an inventory of them and they're protecting over them. It always throws us a little bit off guard. And the reason for that is because we know that our hierarchy of values are completely constructed. And our mythologies of value are constructed. And if someone upsets the public secret, which is that this is all made up, you know, what we consider to be worthwhile and not worthwhile, and they're sort of a thorn in the side of the Republic of meaning. And so, yeah, when you're able to excavate and scavenge some trivial detail, it means the world to people. Strange thing how the particular and the universal sort of can bind that way. Cool, very cool.
Perfect. So we can go on then to Skartadoi.
Hi, it's actually Skartado, Georgia. I'm from Greece. I guess my most distinctive quality is that I work with an endless train of thoughts, like through unlimited semiosis. So I don't know if it is an advantage or a disadvantage, but I can fill thousands of pages with statements that cancel themselves, that try to find only one word, basically, that could describe the whole sum of the pages.
Oh, that's excellent. When you say, I don't know if it's an advantage or disadvantage, that's a perfect point of departure, because anything, including radical disadvantages, can be turned into advantages if you enter the deceptive framework. So some of my favorite practitioners of style are shy. Shyness is a great style if you know how to work it right, not as a kind of failure of social image, but as a kind of power in and of itself. Nietzsche, by all historical accounts, was shy. So was Hidayat, who we're going to read next year. I mean, you wouldn't think at the surface that and you could almost see how pathetic it would be if Nietzsche, every time he went to a dinner party, you know, or arrived at a cheap hotel in Italy where he was staying, would be this ranting, raving, overhuman sort of Zarathustra-esque figure. It would become a parody. You know, it'd be a kind of pitiful overcompensation. So I love the fact that there's subtlety in that. Introversion, which is what you talked about, having this sort of endless stream of thoughts going on in the head, that can also be, for lack of a better word, weaponized into a wonderful strategic advantage that people gravitate towards. You know, in many ancient tribes, albinos were worshipped. It's an interesting feature. And the reason I bring that up is because I actually think there's a greater ethical understanding of beauty in the ancient world often than in the modern one, where in the modern world we prized sameness, sort of, you know, Kardashian-esque replication, sort of surgical sort of replication of the same. Whereas in the ancient world, that which was most unlike ourselves was the most fascinating. You follow? And so, again, it's not to idealize the history of deformity, because there's a lot of cruelty sort of invested in that as well. But there were these things where the one who looked nothing like the others was considered the most beautiful. And so introversion and shyness and interiority can have that function. You know, while everyone else is at the party talking, Gatsby never speaks. He also never joins. He sits sort of at kind of a pedestal to himself. And so it made me think of that when you said that. Thank you.
Thank you. So we can now go then to Alejandra.
Hi.
No.
Hi. I think I cannot live alone, so I've always lived in collective. So I think that's my quality, because I've been living in different cities since I was a child, and I needed to start it again once and again, and I never could live alone. So I all the time started to make like good, not good, like I don't know how to. Yeah, I had to live like in like a big family with people that are new in my life. I think that is.
Excellent. You know, that's something very important to think about. You know, the more that we, you know, Kierkegaard once said, he said, that doesn't mean that all people like Nietzsche have an inherent suspicion and paranoia. And yet, if you read Nietzsche's writing, he's always searching for a collective. And beyond the philosophers of the future, right? But here's an interesting thing. It's not always just about finding the collective, it's about summoning them, which it sounds like when you said sort of, I have to sort of find them. That's an active search. You know, it's not accidental which configurations you've entered into. It's forming, again, alignments and alliances very carefully. And knowing then what people embody. It's a tough question. It's a good one. Nice. Thank you.
Thank you. So we can now go then to Sebastian. I think you're currently muted.
Sorry. Hey, I'm Sebastian, and I think that some of my answers might be a bit similar to some of the people that already came before me. But I think that
I'm kind of like trying to think a lot about how inauthenticity could be a productive tool of navigating certain institutional surroundings, but also the way how being vigilant and observant could be used as tools without being expressed explicitly. Yeah.
Nice, definitely. Seeing how inauthenticity can be a space of productivity. Mystics have perfected this sort of throughout history too, you know, the good ones. Being the irrelevant sort of figure, being the one who doesn't count sort of, is something that places you in an extremely powerful position of influence, actually, but an alternative kind of influence. It's not the influence of the king. You know, again, there's a whole history of analyzing fools also in literature, you know, and why is it that the fool is able to get away with saying things to the king that no other person in the court would ever dare, right? You know, the king would cut the head off or cut the throat of a general or an advisor or anyone who mocked him, but the fool can jump up on the throne, can imitate the king, can mock the king. And if you notice in King Lear by Shakespeare, I don't know why I'm going to that except for this reason, that when King Lear, who's this very tyrannical authoritarian personality, gets overthrown by his deceptive daughters, and he's cast out into exile into this sort of bad land, this nowhere beyond the kingdom, the only person who shows up to guide him into survival is the fool. And the fool changes the tonality completely at that moment. It's no longer just this sort of silly, you know, sort of idiot by the wayside. He says, now I'm basically your master. You have to learn how to be a fool if you want to survive the outer world now. So I like that when you say that. Yeah, absolutely. Right on.
Perfect. So let's go down to Nikki. I don't know if she can hear us.
Can you hear me?
Hello, Nikki.
Hi. My connection is kind of bad, so I'll just turn my video on for a minute. My name is Nikki, and I'm living in Detroit. Technically Hamtramck, and an enclave of Detroit. My quality, I think, at first, ambiguity came to my mind. Ambiguity sometimes through like silence or like selectivity. But I also was thinking about charm, because a lot of like excess, or how I access people or places or situations, can be through like charm, or like building relationships and long-term networks. And yeah.
Excellent. That's a very powerful concept. Charm shares the etymology with charisma. And it's interesting. A charm can, as you know, either be an object, like a token that's a talisman or an amulet and all that, or it can be an affect, to be charming, which is what you're using it as. Interesting thing, it comes from the Greek word karos, which means gift. And that's because the Greeks, the ancient Greeks, felt that it was an inborn quality. It wasn't something that was learned or refined over time. We're going to try and prove the ancient Greeks wrong, that it's not intrinsic. When you look at someone like Rasputin, who was, you know, sort of a dark rogue monk who was accused of all kinds of heresies and things like that, the stare or the gaze in his eyes, his charming sort of quality, even if it was a kind of terrifying charm, that's absolutely practiced. You know, it's something that he definitely develops over time, in the same way that even revolutionary icons like Che Guevara and Malcolm X, they're very charming figures, but their personas sort of and their performativities of charm are actually antithetical to who they really were in many ways. If you just Google image Malcolm X or Che Guevara, you almost always see them smiling in pictures. You know, by almost all historical records, both were extremely severe men who almost never smiled. So the choice, the very deliberate choice to portray themselves sort of with this large grin, it's kind of like the Cheshire Cat, you know, it's something that magnifies their persona and their presence. It's a sort of a weapon of their charm. And we'll get into how one decides what will be the source of their charm. And it can be a smile, or it can be a certain look, you know, in the eyes, or it can be a certain twitch or a certain tick that's built in there that becomes the feature. Very cool. Thank you, Nick.
Perfect. So we'll go to Aliaskar. Can you hear us?
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Perfect.
I'm also from Iran, but I live in London. I was thinking something that I can pick up is that I pay attention a lot to the details, and I have a good memory, like visual memory. I can remember faces, and sometimes it could be quite creepy for people because I can go to a party and I can remember a face and I can fascinate them, just tell them that I see you go to work every day at that time from that station and you wear this style. Or I also bump into people all the time. I live in London and I bump into people on daily basis. And I don't know if it's linked to this attention that I have and the memory I have and remembering it. And sometimes there's a melancholia in it because I can remember a lot of faces all the time. So as I walk in the street, I can remember that I remember many faces. But sometimes I can tell people that I remember them, and sometimes I can keep it for myself. And there's a power to it.
That's fascinating. You know, when we get to Kafka's Blue Octavo Notebooks, he reverses your ability slightly by saying, I'm someone who exudes something that everyone thinks they know me and remembers me from somewhere. So you can actually transfer that. If you can harness the energy of whatever it is that allows you to remember others and their impressions, you can also engrave the impression, even if a false impression. You know, sort of, if we bother to get into this just quickly, Kierkegaard in Either Or is one of his masterpieces. He has a book called The Diary of the Seducer. I don't know if any of you have heard of it. And in it, he tells this story about this gentleman who wants to seduce this sort of young woman in a certain way. And his first strategy is to show up in the background of places for a few months, sort of imperceptibly, so that he ingrains himself as someone that she feels that she's seen before. So she'll be buying a book in a bookstore and he'll just be in the aisle somewhere. So she may be with a passing glimpse, you know, sort of notices him or something like that, but he never makes an introduction. He makes sure to keep enough distance. And the effect that he's trying to conjure is that when they finally do have their first official encounter, she will feel as if he's either an old soul that she has some sort of kindred alliance with, or that it's destiny. So he creates an air of fatalism. So you can turn your ability in a very malicious way if you wanted to, by the way, or a playful way. It's a very cool thing. Nice. And by the way, in terms of that, when people, there's a fine line between scopophilia and scopophobia. Scopophilia is to love to be watched or seen, and scopophobia is the fear of being seen. So if you think in even terms of social games that we play, someone looks at you across a room for 2 seconds, it's flattering perhaps, right? There's a kind of allure to that. But someone who looks for 8 seconds is creepy. Now it's just a 6-second temporal shift of the pendulum in one direction or another, and they go from sort of a sort of potential intimacy to stalker sort of territory, right? And so yeah, it's a very careful balance that you have to walk with that, right? Of remembering people and all of that, and because it means that you've looked closely, right? Obviously. Cool, cool. Where we go next?
We'll go then to Alexei.
Hi, can you see me?
Yes.
So I think I will go with solitude, maybe. I've lived in several places, and I've lived for the last 2 years in Finland, and there my socialization process didn't go quite as well as in all the other places. So I had an experience that not a lot of people get to experience at all, I think, because sometimes I wouldn't physically speak to anyone for like 4 weeks in a row or 5 weeks in a row. So at this point, I experienced being on my own in a distant manner that is hard to describe already.
Perfect. You know, so people who are professional deceivers, one of them is fugitives, people who are fugitives, obviously, and they always have to live in solitude as well. Solitude for me is one of the most powerful and intriguing concepts. If you take it to its extreme limit, there's an idea of absolute solitude that Blanchot hints at, where he basically says, I'm kind of extrapolating it further, but it's the idea of not being alone by yourself, but being so alone that you're not even alone with yourself anymore. Which means you no longer have recourse to subjectivity or to saying I. Now this is particularly crucial because when I studied prison poets, and I spoke with many prison poets across the world over time, they would tell you the first thing that happens when you get thrown into a dungeon or an isolation chamber or solitary confinement is you talk to yourself. It grounds you in some semblance of sanity or hope. But the person who loses even the ability to talk to themselves goes beyond even hermetic solitude, which is, hermits are constantly talking to themselves a mile a minute. That's why if you ever meet New York City cab drivers, oftentimes you get in the car and they're right in the middle of a thought process and they just roll you into it. Like, so I was telling the guy, what guy? You should start the story, sort of some information, but they're already in mid trajectory. And they just really, but to be at such an absolute sort of extreme of solitude where even identity becomes obsolete and the I becomes an irrelevant thing, that actually is the basis of the liar in a certain way. It's an interesting thing. It's one of the criteria the liar will get to at a certain level, which is why all that's left is exteriority, which we'll get into. It's very cool though. Thank you, Alex.
Perfect. So we'll go now last to Guilherme.
Hey, I'd say that, can you hear me?
Perfect.
Yeah, I'd say that I'm very solipsistic, and I'm also very much the cliche of the lone wolf as opposite of Alejandra. I often spend 2-3 days without talking with anyone by my own will, often deciding to mold events towards interpretations that benefit me in a stoic mindset. I'm also a big fan of Baudrillard's simulacrum, and I love being a foreigner in a country where I don't speak the language, where I just don't understand anything around me. I'm also very much of a voyeur, especially online. I hate to have the sound of notifications, the constant presence of, but I spend a lot of time on it, but only as a voyeur. I don't really post anything or.
Excellent. So first thing to that is, so we have Alejandra, Alexi, and Guilherme have all said that different registers of solitude versus sort of intersubjectivity or collectivity. They're not, it's interesting how the paradox or the contradiction of modern industrial society, Baudrillard is the one who figures this out, is actually that they're not mutually exclusive. So New York City is one of the most busy so is Tokyo, one of the most busy overpopulated places, all the commotion, all the noise. And they're, just starkly solitary and alienated from one another. If you look at New York City crowds, no one looks each other in the eye. No one dares to make, never mind speech. Eye contact is the first law of walking through New York. You just don't look people in the eyes. You don't touch, you don't say anything, you don't share details. And so it's an interesting thing actually. And in Japan, they have this phenomenon called the hikikomori, which is like the missing million generation. Have some of you heard of this? Which is over 1 million Japanese youth sort of live in complete detachment from society. This is not old sort of hermeticism where you go off into a forest or you go into the top of a mountain. They're right in the center of Tokyo in these large skyscraper metropolitan buildings that overlook all the noise, all the movement, all the light, artificial light of the city. It's an interesting thing. So their solitude is, I always like to say, it's not agoraphobia, which is fear of the outside. It's claustromania. It's love of the inside.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, growing up, I didn't spend a lot of time by myself as a teenager, and then I got into Nietzsche, and I read Essay Homo, and since then, I've been very much within that mindset.
Nice. No, definitely. And one other thing, when you said I liked being in a place where the language is foreign, Deleuze and Guattari get into a little bit with the sort of Trojan horse way that Kafka, Celan, and others can only do what they do very, very transfiguratively to the German language because they have an accent, because they're not native speakers. And the fact that they choose the dominant language of those who called them the enemy, you know, sort of during the Holocaust. And they infiltrated, and Kafka just twists German in a way that no native speaker would. And so does Salam. You know, and it's horrendously beautiful and haunting what they're able to do precisely because they write with an accent. So there's something very powerful about that status too. Cool. Anybody left, Federico, or have we exhausted the players?
I think that was the last one. Since
intriguing, you know that almost everybody noted sort of tendencies about their own identity, which is intriguing to me, about their own selfhood. And rather than something like, you know, I'm fascinated by the history of Chinese dragons, or, you know, I've spent years in the archives learning about the history of surfing. You follow? Or some sort of other object or something like that. And that's intriguing to me, because if you think about how identity functions, this is a very crucial sort of element to me. If you think about how identity functions in terms of naming in, let's say, martial arts worlds versus everyday human society. So if you watch an old Kung Fu film, you'll see that some master shows up in a village randomly, and everybody takes 3 steps back and takes a breath and gasps, and someone says, what is it? And he says, that's the master of the 5-fingered iron claw technique, right? And when the guy hears them saying that out of the corner of his ear, he smiles with pride. You know, it's not, hey, there's John, you know, or there's Bob. It's not the generic name that we all have and possess. It's a title that's bestowed upon him for some highly exclusive particularity. That there's one technique. He's not the master of Kung Fu in its totality. He's the master of a single ability or technique, a striation, that only he or she knows how to adapt and will. And that takes the place of generic identity, the desire for recognition, the desire for belonging, the desire for sameness, which is all fascist psychology at some level, right? To be part of the crowd, to be part of the march, to disappear into the anonymity of the collective. We have to be very aware of that, right? To kill the fascist within ourselves, as Foucault said once. And so, yeah, to displace yourself simply as this impersonal sort of third person, it, the one who can do it. You follow? And to be known for that one thing. I remember there was a small town that I once visited, a very rural place where there was an individual, he wasn't particularly smart or worldly or cultured or interesting, except that he was known all throughout the towns surrounding as having an iron grip of a handshake. And people used to introduce him that way, from that one singular feature. Oh my God, this guy, it's like a vice grip. And he should have, because he was a blacksmith. And so it was part of the orientation of his swinging of the arms and that sort of metallic rhythm he had. So he'd gained that muscularity in his grip. Every time someone introduced him that way, you would see this huge smile of accomplishment on his face. It's the most trivial detail. It doesn't make you rich. It doesn't make you powerful. It doesn't make you anything in the world, except that you have one thing that no one else has. Finding that one detail is the first inroad of the liar. You know, how in a gathering of 200 people can you differentiate or distinguish yourself? And it's almost never by talking about yourself. It has to be about talking about some trick in your arsenal, some remote horizon that has nothing to do, but which you nevertheless have the keys to. You follow? And so that's an element of deception for us today. And it's a great question, because typically, again, when we're forced to present ourselves, whether it's in academic or social environments, we're asked to present ourselves again in terms of legitimate information. 1, your origin, where do you come from? 2, what have you studied, which is your education and your class that you're revealing, by the way, simultaneously, as well as social status. These are the things that you get from that, hey, what's your name and what do you do for a living, which are the first 2 questions that people ask you at a party. But the deceiver is the one who throws an irregular, unusual, seemingly trivial detail that nevertheless is enigmatic and puzzling enough that it makes you want to talk to them all night. Follow? So choosing that is no accident either. That's why the test was sort of, what is the most fascinating sort of particularity that one could summon? And we all have them. It's just about thinking about what they are. And you notice, by the way, Lairman, I think you mentioned Ekeoma, right? By Nietzsche. He starts revealing that about himself in Ekeoma, which is the greatest autobiography ever written. You know, chapter 1, why I am so wise. Chapter 2, why I'm so clever. Chapter 3, why I write such great books. And that's awesome. You have to give credit. That's hilarious, sort of in the immensity of it. And also because he's playing sort of playfully as a fool, but also if you call his bluff, he is that dangerous and that severe. He has broken the back of the history of thought. So I love the fact that he plays it light, but it has very serious consequences. But what I was going to say is that it's in Ekeoma that he starts revealing very strange personal details, from his diet to his favorite forms of walking, to even things like he says, a lot of people have an evil eye, I have an evil ear. Like those dogs or those creatures that can hear storms from a distance, I can always sense trouble. So he makes a kind of a cool relation to intuition there even. So if we can go, yeah, we got time. If we can go a little bit further, thank you for all of that. I want to share something else with all of you, which is, if we go back to this screen, can everybody see it?
Yes, perfect.
Okay,
Yes.
Great. Let's do from current slide again. All right, so here are 3 quotes that I just want to sort of get into quickly. For me, the counter figure to, I mentioned the great Gatsby earlier, who's a perfect liar. He's an imposter, but he's actually not the liar that intrigues me the most. Gatsby does something relatively easy, which is he studies pre-existing paradigms of beauty, of status, of all these things, and he just magnifies himself already according to the known sort of frameworks of success within the social world. He knows how to dress in suits that are the nicest suits. He fashions the nicest way of speaking that shows that he's learned and educated. He buys the biggest house. He basically just imports all of the established tastes of the day, right? He's extremely timely. I'm less interested in him ultimately as the imposter than I am with another figure written around the same time, a little bit earlier, which is Ahab. Captain Ahab in Melville's Moby Dick. Because Captain Ahab is the opposite of Gatsby. He is hideous, he is cruel, he is misanthropic, he hates people around him. He's frenzied, he's insane. You know, he has none of the composure or calculated nature of Gatsby. And he's consumed with an obsessive quest to go into the blackest reaches of the ocean and to fight this sort of mysterious whale. And yet people follow him. Just like Gatsby, but even more powerfully, they follow Gatsby to the point where they kill him, which is exactly how social celebrity works. You exhaust them at their pinnacle and then you sacrifice them, and that's why they self-destruct most of the time. And you see, and then you interchange them with the new version, right? The new celebrity icon. But Ahab is the one who can command people to their fatal reaches, to sacrificial depths where they're going to drown in the ocean and they know it, but they can't resist him. This is something Deleuze calls the unstoppable. He doesn't say much about it except that he calls it the unstoppable. And we have to see what type of deceptive power is at work in Ahab's character, that people would actually get on that damned ship knowing that he's throwing them into the most deranged struggle where they are destined to fail. Right? So if you look at the way that Ahab himself describes it here, that's the 3rd quote below. Actually, real quick, before we get to him, let's just do this. Look at the top quote. This is by a great Syrian poet, Adonis, one of my absolute favorites, where he just says, I shout that time is punctured, that its walls have crumbled in my bowels. I vomited, I have no history, no present. I am solar insomnia, the abyss, sin and action. My possessions beguile, the sun strikes my limbs. I read in pages yellowing that I shall die in exile. I lit up the deserts, my people stray. What you're seeing there with Adonis's work there is you see a figure who is in a state of raving. And raving is actually a deceptive eloquence of something. So what he's doing essentially there is he's in this fever dream where certain great Middle Eastern poets are capable of this. Again, Ahmad Shamlu is wonderful at this. Certain others, where they hit an outer limit of rage, right, of an excessive sort of state of mind, where they just start making these huge gargantuan statements about themselves. Again, Nietzsche has it in Ecce Homo too, where he says things like, I'm not a man, I'm dynamite. Right? Lines like that. So you see that. I shout that time is punctured, that it swells. How you actually can do that, how you can accelerate oneself to this point of feverish, Artaud writes like this as well, if you read him closely, just this automatic, almost just venomous purging of words in which you become deified, you become almost godlike, right? And yet it's a God who is about to condemn itself, a God who is sort of on a mission to destroy itself. So you read that there, that's going to be important, because if you go back, sorry to take you on a deviation here, but it's a crucial one. If you go back to Homer's Iliad, you notice that Achilles spends 90% of the text doing nothing, or apparently doing nothing. 90% of these gruesome sort of battle scenes where people are being stabbed and killed and thrown, sort of their corpses thrown from side to side. And there's Achilles on the beach throwing a temper tantrum, refusing to fight because he's at odds with the king, the Greek king, and he's just pacing the whole time. And every once in a while, out of the corner of his narrative eye, Homer reminds the reader, and in the distance you can see Achilles just pacing the beach, either playing a flute or just talking to himself or just walking. And you think that he's in a state of idleness. He's not. He's in a state of conservation of energy and building of energy to the point of eruption. It's a very calculated, strategic thing, pacing like a sort of a cramped animal over and again, sort of in an incantatory state, entrancing himself to be ready, which is why at the end of the text, when Achilles finally finds his excuse or trigger, which could be any justification, to join the battle, I love it when Homer says that the entire Greek army takes 3 steps back from him, because they know that when he's in that modality, anything in his line of sight will be killed. And he just unleashes pure rage across the battlefield. And it's at that point that actually there's a river god that Achilles keeps throwing corpse after corpse, bloody corpse into one, and the river god is choking from blood because of the excess of bodies. And the river god goes up to Mount Olympus and complains to the other gods and says, stop Achilles, he offends me. He has insulted my river. I'm choking in my throat with blood. And you know what Zeus says? We can't. The law of divinities only work with those who respect order. Rage supersedes divine will. They can't stop Achilles. This first passage that we're looking at by the Syrian poet Adonis is precisely that state of frenzy and of feverish sort of rage, where you can make these massive sort of gargantuan statements and you just can't even insert yourself into the narrative. That's going to be a crucial form of deception, because that's a process. The next is this Iraqi figure, Hassan Blasim, again, who was a refugee. And he just says, here we can read it together quickly. My task is to exaggerate the truth, to spread panic about drought, to paint a bleak picture of the many villages that lie scattered along the banks of the river Nabi, which runs between my country and that of our hostile neighbors. We've been fighting ruinous wars with these neighbors since the dawn of history. The fragile peace we now have with them is just a dormant volcano. I'm currently contributing to a narrative that concludes with the volcano erupting once again. Without water, blood will flow. Thirst will arouse that brutal, hostile memory. And it won't be just humans that will perish, but also rare birds and insects and the flocks of animals that provide the local people with their sustenance, not to mention the rhythm of their lives. So here we have a kind of anarchist troublemaker, a provocateur, who's going from place to place spreading doomsday prophecies. And that's a certain type of deceptive posture as well that we want to get into, the one who calculates precisely how to collapse edifices. But if you read it closely, remember I said that I'm only interested in kind of vitalist practitioners of deception who ultimately leave you in more powerful positions as a result of their deception. And that's what actually he's trying to do here, is to unbind them from other forms of of being, which are stagnant and deathly. So the final one, if we just get down quickly to, this is from Ahab, this is from Moby Dick, and he's talking about the whale here. It was a black and hooded head, and hanging there in the midst of so intense a calm, it seemed the sphinxes in the desert. Speak, thou vast and venerable head, muttered Ahab, which though ungarnished with a beard, yet here and there lookest hoary with mosses. Speak, mighty head, and tell us the secret thing that is in thee. Of all divers, thou hast dived the deepest. That head upon which the upper sun now gleams has moved amid this world's foundations, where unrecorded names and navies rust, and untold hopes and anchors rot, wherein her murderous hold this frigate earth has ballasted with bones of millions of the drowned. There in that awful waterland, there was thy most familiar home. Thou hast been where bell or diver never went, has slept by many a sailor's side, where sleepless mothers would give their lives to lay them down. Right? And he ends by even saying, O head, thou hast seen enough to split the planets and make an infidel of Abraham, and not one syllable is thine. Meaning he doesn't even speak a word, and it has this power. What we see here is a deceptive projection of creating an enemy or a nemesis, which represents the ultimate. And by extension, what that does, because this whale then is the only being who has ever been to those depths, has only experienced sort of the outer reaches of these agonies, these pains, these sensitivities and all that, it then requires and enables Ahab to create a persona or a mask of his own that will rival it. You see, so by building sort of this contestation or this war between him and this other creature, and this other creature is unparalleled, is unprecedented by nature, by virtue of that he himself then will have to become unparalleled and unprecedented, something which can't be imitated or replicated. And so this is a part of the practice. And notice how he goes from the depths of the ocean ultimately to the splitting the planets. This is also something Deleuze and Guattari, or Deleuze calls this the schizophrenic depth in the logic of sense, where he says the schizophrenic has a way of binding the particular and the universal into a kind of gravitational center or a whirlpool, whereby everything falls into itself. And that's exactly what he's doing as well. And this is crucial because the liar is the one by definition who doesn't waste anything, doesn't waste time, doesn't waste chances, doesn't waste words, makes use of everything. So for that, we have to step outside of the idea of being alienated or being bored. A liar is never bored because they can twist the scenario or the atmosphere in whatever direction they wish. Follow? And so as a result of that, this is how you first do it, is by weaving your story, and that's what a schizophrenic does as well. Everybody is relevant to whatever paranoiac or ecstatic delusion they're engaged with at that moment. If they feel they're being followed, everyone eventually is following them, right? And so this is something that the liar must do as well, must weave sort of seamlessly every atmosphere, every space, every time, every experience into whatever it is they're attempting at that moment, into the experiment. So with all of that said, that's a lot. Again, that's a kind of excessive showering of things sort of in one day. Let's open things up to discussion. If there are any questions, we've got a half an hour to throw dice now.
So does anybody want to chip in on the subject of deception?
I had a thought, and I heard you talking about the variations of lies, especially about the lies of nature. But I mean, that was the beginning of the thought, that actually lying or not lying is not about the identity of the person performing the lie, but it is about the audience. Like, I mean, the sound is not lying by going everywhere. It is in its identity, in its truth to do these things. And the lie has to do with the audience somehow.
Absolutely. That's why we were saying it's a sensitivity to the outside and how it affects the outside. Great liars will discard their trajectory of their lie if they notice it's not working, right? So if they see that your eyes start to glaze and there's boredom, right, and that the rhythms aren't working, they start to fluctuate and oscillate their tonalities, their rhythms, their postures, their gestures, their images, sort of whatever strikes. sort of according. They're constantly pitching things to find where there's sort of an attunement there. So you're absolutely right about that. But it's something interesting when you said about nature. You know, the ancients understood, before we created sort of our utopian shopping malls where it's always air conditioned and you have the white noise playing in the background, the ancients knew that they were in a very unruly universe, in a very monstrous and dangerous universe where even the most, not forget transcendent gods who are sort of disturbing to them, the most elemental forces were unreliable. And it wasn't clear what type of relationality they had to us. You know, fire warms you, it keeps you alive. It's the sort of one of the most essential things to human civilization, but it also kills you if you're consumed by it. It burns your house down. Water is in 90% of your bloodstream in your body. It sustains you. You need water, otherwise you die of thirst, and yet you drown in it. Right? Even I mean, space itself. So it's the earth, dust, you know, dirt. It's the soil for harvest. It's where we get our sustenance. At the same time, it opens up sometimes and swallows you if there's an earthquake. You know, and so all of these things, they have that extreme, those extreme fluctuations built into them. So you're always just dealing with, which is why if you look at the pagan gods, they're moody, they're temperamental. Even the Judaic God is very temperamental. I am an envious God. I am a wrathful God. That means you can't trust me from one night to the other. You catch me in a bad mood in the wrong alleyway, and I'll bring famine to your town, just for the hell of it. And that's something that we have to get into also, among 1,000 other things. Any philosophy of deception has to get into a philosophy of whim as well. The first gods were whimsical, meaning they followed temperament or impulse, right? Not necessarily schemes or destinies or sort of trajectories of history or moral structures. And so when you're in that sort of temperamental cauldron, anything goes. And oftentimes it's a great thing. You know, does anybody here know who Satan descends from? The Egyptian god Set. And the Egyptian god Set actually is the only Egyptian god who doesn't have a clear physiological head. And by that I mean the other ones have a jackal head or an eagle head or a serpent head or a frog's head. And his is some weird creature that is an amalgamation of, looks like kind of an anteater meets a hyena meets a giraffe. It has no category in nature. And Set is the god of storms, foreigners, chaos, and the desert. Very cool conceptual combination by the ancient Egyptians. And he's known to be kind of a trickster god. That's where Satan later takes that legacy. And basically what it means is that Set, when he approaches you, half the time he's leading you, half the time he's misleading you. And you never know which it is. And what I love about it is, unlike the devil, who is always sort of tempting you to destruction, supposedly, Set often saves sometimes saves the entire world in Egyptian narratives and mythologies. There are these rare nights where only Set can save the world. And he does it just for the hell of it, not because he believes in the world or cares for it. And it's kind of a very cool sort of deity in that regard. So yeah, so I like your connection there. Thank you very much. What else we got?
I
got something. Okay, you go first.
No. Okay, thank you. I found an odd relationship between lying and some of the works of colonization, because like it reminds me a lot of the story here in Brazil of colonization, specifically of slaves. They when they were brought, they had their deities that they cultivated, and all of a sudden they started integrating themselves into Catholic cults and everything, but they were always doing them in some sort of equivalency. So they were like sort of making up a way that their imagery would get more friendly to Christian people, and in the way that also Christian imagery would get more, I would say, like palatable for themselves as well. So like they were enmeshing both of these things, and it's the kind of lie that actually, in a way, it refuses the new point of origin that the colonizer was like imposing to them, but also it reinstates their own origin in that narrative. So it actually, like, in a way, it circumscribes their own narrative as originary for themselves. So like when they start making those equivalencies between, let's say, saints and orishas, and making that that sort of common thread line, they were actually claiming a certain common origin while maintaining what they were doing. So like, I believe that there's a lot of potential in this exercise of like syncretism and like assimilating the lie as well. Like they made themselves an object in a way. So like they made their own beliefs a way of like a kind of survival in colonization, which is
absolutely, Rafael. You know, there are 2 points to that. One is that nativism or sort of the exoticization of a pre-colonial past in the political universe of imperialism is often a strategic necessity in order to unbind yourself from the feeling of the totality of the imperial sort of violence, right? So that, and again, you see this everywhere from sort of, well, I mean, you can see it anywhere, even political Islamism is not some medieval throwback. It's none of that. It's a sort of a false nostalgia for a pre-colonial sort of moment. The problem comes into that when all of these new resurrected mythologies and distorted mythologies start to believe themselves, and especially when they take power, right? When they themselves are given power, and then the new nationalisms that are based on, I mean, for me, sort of, if Egyptian identity is bound to British colonialism, bound to medieval Islamism, or bound to ancient pharaonic identity complexes, they're all bad, you know, when they hold the reins of power at some level. Nevertheless, in the immediate moment, there's a reason why Malcolm X sort of helps fabricate this completely alter ego identity for, you know, sort of American, for African Americans in the 1950s and 60s in Harlem. He's not really talking about ancient African civilizations. That's a very ahistorical reading that he does of those early civilizations and all that. They're complete fabrications, but he has, just like any good con man, and he was a great hustler, if you know anything about his criminal history, he realizes something, which is that the only authentic affect for an African American in the 20th century in America is rage. They should be angry. And if they're not, then they're in a state of inauthentic existence or inauthentic consciousness. He will use whatever storytelling or sort of lunatic reimaginings of history in order to get them, right, to rile them. So you're absolutely right that it serves these intriguing purposes. I also find, to your point, I also find it fascinating how certain pagan or magical rituals have existed in Latin America and the Caribbean side by side with the dominant Christian religious orthodoxy.
Yes.
So what's fascinating to me is, like, if you take Castro's Cuba, right? So communism has a sort of an inborn distaste for religious institutions, but Castro couldn't pull off what Stalin did in Russia, which is he didn't close all the churches forcibly, right? So he let that cultural thing sort of exist, but in an irrelevant margin, right, to the social and political issues. Nevertheless, what I find fascinating is that people who are devout Catholics in Cuba or in South America or other parts of Latin America will also practice Santeria and other forms of kind of magical rituals, superstitions. This happens in the Islamic world as well, where you'll have, you know, sort of an older, I happen to know, I have an older aunt who happens to be a practicing sort of Muslim, very devout, but she also loves to go to fortune tellers, and she believes in spells, and she believes in also, and how they can inhabit, especially when the dominant religious orthodoxy refers to that as heresy.
Yeah.
Follow? And yet they can occupy, and they vary in very cool ways. Those counter narratives can be ingested by the same follower, because they're not the same person in those places all the time. And they have many of them inside themselves. You know, this is just a very obvious thing. We're all by nature schizophrenic because we think. Thought itself is a schizophrenic symptom in the sense of multiple identities. Who the hell are we talking to there? Right? So there's many of us. And that's what that sort of showcases, that you can believe in one thing one night and believe in another night, partake of multiple sort of reservoirs of possibilities. Very cool. Yeah.
Yeah.
We'll talk about it. By the way, just one quick thing before we get to Nima in that regard. I mean, Nima had a point too. In the ancient world, when you worshipped an idol, I love this about idolatry. You know, the God is the idol itself. So what happens if one day your kids are in the tent or in your, or whatever, and they knock the idol off the mantle and it shatters? Your God is essentially effectively dead at that point. So you know what you do? You go to your local sculptor and get a new idol, but a different God. And this is your 0-degree opportunity to forge an alternative and a better God, to use your creativity to sort of display new potentials. So it's a very cool idea with that as well. Nima, did you have a point?
I think I would escape it for now because mine was in line with nature, so I would just save this conversation.
Sure. So who else was there?
I wanted to say, can I add the comment?
Please.
I wanted to say that there might be an insecurity that the liar has or the liar feels to tell a lie, but also there's a position of confidence probably in it, and the power that probably the liar has to make someone, by the scenario that they create at some point, by revealing it, make them feel that they know nothing, or they were being played, or they're bringing down their beliefs, and by doing so kind of create new understanding, a new position that they never had before. And that comes from a confidence that the person has by creating that scenario and manipulation.
Well, you know what you're describing, Alaska, you're describing Socrates at some level. Forget his content. His content interests me far less than his methodology. You know, the methodology of approaching you in the marketplace and asking you endless questions, the Socratic dialogue, which seems like it's completely deceptive and disingenuous because it's the appearance of a humble fool. You know, he's coming up asking you what are seemingly harmless questions, pretending like he's just curious or he doesn't understand or he doesn't know. But he's actually an overseer of a maze of thought that he's directing like a lab rat through, right? He's prompting you, he's provoking you, and like a great chess master, he's binding you into certain movements. You know, Heidegger has this quality too, where he starts a line and it seems just like it's harmless, you know, building his dwelling. You go, okay, sure, and you go to the next line. If you accept that premise, it's game over. He's got you. He's already 7 steps ahead, like a great pool player or a great card player. He knows the next movements. And by accepting the first premise, you're already on a trajectory, a sequence, and a succession of inevitable sort of answers that are going to get you to his point. He's going to corner you. So you're absolutely right. And Socrates does mask himself. Also, it's an intriguing thing. We were talking about this earlier in terms of appearance. Nietzsche likes to mention this time and again in a kind of cruel moment. You know that Socrates is famous for being the ugliest person in Athens, right? Just physiologically, I mean, if you've ever seen the only existing statue of him, which is in the Metropolitan Museum in New York, it's awful. It's grotesque. He looks sort of like a mutant in some ways. And Nietzsche makes a kind of backhanded slap to him and says, you know, that's the actual truth. Plato likes to hype it that it was because his ideas were so dangerous that they killed him. And he says they actually killed him because the Greeks worshipped beauty and he was so ugly that they killed him. And Nietzsche is about something there actually, because what he's realizing is that Socrates actually again uses his radical difference of his physiological ugliness as something which makes the youth intrigued by him. Youth are always interested in a new trend, new slang, new trends, new appearances, sort of new emergent properties. And so it's part of his persona. It's not accidental to it that he's able to occupy that space and bring people's guard down and all that. In a weird way, he plays a monster, the role of monstrosity. And monstrosity is always the experience of a face or a body that you have no words for, that you have no idea for yet, you have no pre-existing paradigm. And so that's his innovation, absolutely. But when you say there's a deep insecurity, always in social lying, which is redundant, society is perpetual lying of a certain kind, but it's a petty, pathetic lying of what Jung calls the persona. So it's just, you know, in order to get through my day at work, I have to mask myself in these ways. I have to give off the appearance of propriety, and I can't show any deviancy or any fantasies or any secrets and all of that. That's not the kind of lying that we're dealing with. The ones that we deal with, you know, I'll tell you guys a quick story just quickly. I've been to pirate havens in northern Africa, in Algeria in particular, where you know that everybody who is there in this particular town that's right on the Mediterranean is usually a smuggler of some kind, you know, and they take to the ships every night and they smuggle items throughout the Mediterranean. So they're a transitional community. They're not there for, you know, sort of more than 2 or 3 evenings at a time. And what I love about that place is that you know that everybody who you talk to lies to you. It's just assumed that it's just a universe of continual deception. They're not going to reveal to you what they're carrying, why they're there, what their intentions are, what their identity is, where they come from, right? They displace details, but the very, very meticulous way, masterful way in which they get across points, because they're human too. You know, they're not just completely detached. They have sensations. In fact, they're very hedonistic. So they want to share some type of solidarity with you. So they tell a story in which all of the details are misplaced, but there's an ethos that they're nevertheless conveying, that they want to get across. So if they say, you know, there was this one time that I was going from Croatia to Libya and I was carrying shirts, you know it wasn't Croatia, you know it wasn't Libya, you know it wasn't shirts. And none of these things are the actual details. Nevertheless, what they're trying to get in is the thrill or the risk or the danger or the loss or despair that they suffered that evening. You know, and so yeah, there's something and there's no insecurity. What I love about them, there's no flinching, there's no trembling, there's no hesitancy in their storytelling approaches. So that's that. It's only in the social universe that it becomes, because it's repressive, that we start to showcase insecurities. Cool. What else we got?
Well, I had a remark to the last comment about confidence. Isn't confidence itself an ultimate lie based on perpetual practice of lying to yourself? How could you forge confidence if you haven't tried it before in front of a mirror in your utmost loneliness? So that leads me back to the term lying to yourself as a terrain of practice, like preparing constantly yourself to be confident in order to pull out your role, pull out your hollow role play in the end. So yeah, that was my remark.
Absolutely, David. So what I would say to that is, when we talk about again, nervous sort of practices of deception, we just call that psychology. We can just call that basic human psychology. All psychology is based on it. Where the liar has an advantage in confidence, you're absolutely right, is one, that they practice, but two, that they know something. What they know is an essential sort of starting point to the human experiment, which is that they know that there was an ancestor thousands and thousands of years ago, all of our ancestors, man or woman, who was the first one with some flicker of consciousness walking the earth. That wasn't articulated, it wasn't refined, it wasn't a philosophical viewpoint. They just knew that they existed in some very raw preliminary form. They look around themselves, they see birds screeching, they see skies turning dark, they see trees blowing in the wind, they see creatures devouring other creatures, and there is absolutely no doubt in my mind or the thinkers who contemplate this first human consciousness that the first emotion or affect of human experience is sheer terror. Overwhelming, excessive terror before the infinite. So that figure runs into some cave, uses a little bit of their animal instinct that's left in them to find shelter, which thank God for that. Bataille said beautifully, he said, we all still have a little bit of the animal in us. When we get angry at, you know, family member, friend, grit your teeth, that's the animal still left in you. If you lose that, it's game over. You're a lost cause. You're just an all too human sort of individual. But so this figure, he or she runs into a cave, trembles, the lightning starts striking, they're crying out in despair. The next day, to realize that they don't go mad or become suicidal, they start naming things. Okay, I need some semblance of control, some matrix of meaning. I'll call you, you know, tree. I'll call you sky. I'll call you, and it's a completely arbitrary, concocted children's game, right, that they're doing. Nevertheless, through repetition, and by getting other people enveloped in that conspiracy of false meaning, they can convince themselves or persuade themselves eventually that they know what's going on and that they have some semblance of control in the world. The liar is the one who knows that our ancestors' first experience of the world was pure cowardice and cover-up. And that everything since then, every street we name, every person we name, every structure we build, every political ideology we have, every moral structure we invent, every identity complex we give to ourselves is nothing more than this massive, ridiculous concealment of our originary horror before an excessive, unbound universe. And so, the liar has the strategic advantage not of being less vulnerable than us, but more honest than the rest of us. Of knowing that at the 0 degree, at the base, is nothing but a house of cards and a bunch of language games that are keeping this thing standing. And if you just blow onto that fragile edifice from the right angle, it crumbles. So they are extremely susceptible, and I've written about this before, that there's a beautiful interplay between cruelty and vulnerability. You know, that the ones who are able to practice cruelty in the creative sense, like Artaud's theater of cruelty, are also the most vulnerable. You know, people always say Artaud, inventor of the theater of cruelty. He's also the guy who endured electroshock therapy almost every day in the insane asylum. He knows pain very, very well. He knows suffering. I once asked an Iranian ex-political prisoner, I asked her, she had had her spine shattered 3 times in the jails. And I asked her, she'd been imprisoned by 2 regimes, a monarchy and then a theocracy afterwards. And I asked her one night, I asked her a bad question. I said, who tortured better? And which was an awful way of putting it, but who were the better practitioners of torture? To which she very elegantly replied, she said, well, torture is torture. There's not really better or worse. But she said, if you're asking me who was more masterful about it, definitely the new regime. And for one simple empirical reason, most of them had been tortured. So they knew how to play upon what nerves. They knew what burning felt like. They knew what suffocation felt like. They knew what electrocution felt like. They knew what insomnia and solitary confinement felt like. So they knew how to play it like chords of an instrument, like strings or like piano notes. And so the great liar is someone who experiments on themselves, first and foremost. Even the alchemists, it's a great question. If you look back at medieval alchemists, and we'll talk about actually one when we get to the end of the course, an absolute great figure, Al-Qurtubi. They had these students who at night, they would subject to all kinds of bizarre experiments, ingesting of different substances, some of which were poisonous, just to test the levels of what point something becomes violently toxic and all that. And if you ask yourself, how on earth would these disciples agree to inflict such harm or damage upon their own bodies? The reason is because all their masters were severely scarred. They had credibility with them. They knew that their masters would never inflict upon them something that they hadn't done to themselves 1,000 times worse. And so half the alchemical masters were blind, or had lost limbs, or had burn marks across the body. And so that's something to the liar too. The liar is fully invested. It's not a distantiated posture like a sadist. A sadist takes distance from the act. A sadist will never inflict violence upon themselves. You follow? But the liar will lie to themselves and lie to the other. And actually to the point where they become seamlessly intertwined, where self and other are kind of drowning almost in a liquefied fashion into one another. They become co-conspirators, they become collaborators, they become mutually possessed by the strength of the lie, or the elegance of the lie. That's what interests me, not as imposing sort of cruel mythologies on people that just harm them. That makes sense.
Could you also say that it's interesting when this deception strategy becomes a strategy, for example, in creative practices or art, that particularly this second in my mind, I remember the last chapter of Ring of Saturn, W.J. Ziebald, when he tells all this stuff about his trip and stories, and the last chapter he says that he visited this library and there's a catalog and there's all the details and the collection, and then it was all a lie. There was nothing. It was just in his mind. And that's kind of the moment that in the last pages of the book, you kind of say like, oh, are you telling me that all your trip was also a lie? And then this becomes like a strategy that you can kind of play it in multiple layers as well. Or I don't know, even in film, it comes to my mind, Burning, for example. The film Burning, it was 2018. Who was the director, John Subam or someone. And you accept that when you're watching a film, you accept that you are watching a fiction, but you are in the position that you already know. But then when it becomes a strategy, the director still put you in a position that you don't know which of these scenarios were right, or you cannot judge. And this uncomfortable position that as a strategy of deception, you're forced to be in that position. And again, when it becomes to like knowledge, maybe like learning or unlearning.
Absolutely. So it's a lot there just to unpack, but let's unravel it this way quickly, which is there's a genre that only children gravitate towards, which is a genre of literature called choose your own adventure stories. Some of you know about this, and that's where, you know, you'll get to a point on page 16 in the story and it will give you a choice. And it'll say, you know, to the child reader, if you want to go into the castle, you know, go to page 27. If you want to turn into the forest, go to page, you know, 45. And then this is the amazing correct impulse of the child, whose sort of imagination still is like a fairy tale imagination of multiple open pathways. They go quickly, they read the castle story as fast as they can to see where it ends, and then they go back and they go the other one, to the forest. Right? They don't settle on one thing the way we do with life, quite tragically. You know, sort of that's precisely our approach to life, this kind of finite one-dimensionality of thinking you have one life, one path, one progression, one destiny, one identity. Right? And so a genre that sort of in that regard, it's something that Nietzsche calls a will to chance. And I love that paradox. The will to chance means that you deliberately position yourself in a place where you are susceptible to pure chance. It's almost like parachuting into a city that you know nothing about, into a random place where you have no map or no orientation and no touristic neurosis of, oh, I better see these landmarks or these monuments, because if I don't, then it was a wasted journey. You just wander. You become the wanderer through alleyways and through different passageways and tunnels. And choosing left or right, there is no governing logic of superiority, except that something catches you sort of out of the side of your eye. And so to that, we can end even on this point. One of the great concepts that is so crucial to deception is something I call intimation. Intimation just means a hint or a partial glimpse of something, right? So if you are the liar, the master liar at a party, and you want basically someone to follow you, you want them to chase you, you offer them a partial glimpse of something, right? This is Alice's White Rabbit, right? That it's not something she understands, she doesn't know the rabbit, she doesn't know where it's going. It sort of fleetingly just passes out of the corner of her eye and her peripheral vision, and she feels this irresistible urge to chase it. That's curiosity, which Heidegger said is the worst philosophical impulse. I think it's one of the best philosophical impulses. And it's, by the way, how you don't end up joining a fascist party, because you're too aligned with curiosities rather than with serious promises that never fulfill their promise, but just end up in genocides usually. But this Alice in Wonderland thing, if you look again at the four figures who are willing to always chase an intimation, which means, I take this very seriously, they abandon guaranteed solid reality to go after a voice or an apparition or a sighting. That's the child who's always willing to do that. By the way, notice this, if you ever play with a child a game and you say halfway through the game before anyone's won or lost, let's play a different game, they almost always say yes. They don't need the resolution of being the winner or the loser. They always want the new possibility. So the child does that, the animal does that. You'll be playing with the animal or feeding the animal, they hear a noise at the door. They leave you, they abandon you, they desert you, they're traitorous in that beautiful way. To go chase something, they don't even know what's on the other side of the door. They just know it's better than whatever they already have, right? The other figure is the madwoman or the madman, the lunatic, also chases voices. and gives up on solid material realities for this immaterial plane of visions. And finally, the prophet. All prophetic sort of narratives are based on the one who's willing to abandon their tribe and go up on the mountain to chase a voice, who they have no reason to believe is worth listening to. Right? So we have to enter that domain of intimation, where we're willing to sell out the real and go chasing whatever fleeting glimpse comes out of the corner of the eye. That's the first step. And we'll start, by the way, next week then with Sadr Hedayat's Blind Owl. It's the first half of his novella. It's a very complex and problematic work historically. It was banned. You're reading sort of illegal, illicit materials. It was banned by multiple regimes in its country of origin. My grandfather, who was a teacher of literature and a high school principal, lost 3 of his students to suicide because of this work. For those Iranians in the room who know it, it unleashed a bit of an epidemic of suicides among youth. Not because the text itself is inherently suicidal, but because the author killed himself after writing it, and they so adored and worshipped his power as an author that they followed him off the cliff. Don't do that, please. We have 8 seminars to do this, and we got a lot to go. So don't fall victim to Hedayat's magic and his sorcery. Just know that every line, I'm going to tell you something at the outset, every line is a deception and a trap. Right? He works it that way. And so you don't want to believe necessarily. He's going to throw you a narrator, and it's one of his tricks, a narrator who seems very vulnerable and defenseless, and that is the perfect decoy for an architect and a puppet master who above is pulling the strings. Right? So just fall into it. And there's one other thing. We're going to start just some quick presentations informally next week. The first assignment, if we want to call it that, the first experiment for all of you is to locate it's in the syllabus as well, a legend, folktale, story, myth, or superstition that engages with the question of deception, sort of in some profound, interesting way. There's no right or wrong answer here. Find as obscure as something as you can find, ancient gods of deception, creatures, phenomena, again, narratives, whatever you want. But just find it from some long-lost civilization, from any part of the world, any cultural tradition, any mythology that you want, and bring them ready to just, we'll have any 3 of you that want to present for 5 minutes next week. Just tell us the story, the atmosphere, the characters, the backdrop, and try and unfold some theory of deception. Knowing that it's not an exhaustive universal theory, it's just a theory that works at that moment, in that space, in that time. It's one among many. So if anybody wants to volunteer that, do you know how that usually gets chosen?
Yes, usually we have 2 presenters on the main text and 2 respondents to the Blind Owl. Plus, since you mentioned the assignment, I don't know if you want to assign...
The assignment of the Blind Owl, which is that we'll have a collection. But at the end, I'd like to have some sort of original storytelling or mythology that you guys bring to the forefront. Again, Babylonian, Sumerian, Egyptian, Chinese, Persian, Caribbean, East European, you take your pick. Just find me some story that deals with that from some other time and place. And that'll be the focus of the presentations rather than the main text, which we'll go through together. Okay? So does anybody offhand just want to, everybody will get a turn to do this in the coming weeks. And it'll be
so, I'm sorry. So what would like to present for next week?
I would do it.
Thank you, David.
Yeah.
We need one more at least.
Hey, can I ask a question? If we do it, if I go next week, does that mean that is that the only presentation that I have, or is there something?
No, there will be other opportunities. You can always always try out things later. It's not a limitation. It's just to add some alternatives. Because again, storytelling is going to be one. There's going to be one week where we're doing visual aesthetics. So I'll ask you to find a contemporary artwork from an artist. It's a dancer, painter, installation artist of some kind. One week will be literary or poetic work. One will be a philosophical. So you'll see. But this is our first. We're going to start with sort of the ancient myths and see what you can come up with. But you can always bring other things, of course, and you'll be writing continually for this. Oh yeah, should we mention that, Federico, that also it's just write one page of analysis that unfolds the mythology or the legend or the superstition or folktale, and at the same time is theorizing a sort of a deceptive matrix.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand. And everybody needs to find the legend or only the presenters?
No, everybody.
Ah, okay.
Everybody's going to be writing about that instead of just.
Jason, I have a question. One thing I haven't understood thoroughly was about Sadeh Hedayats, the blind all. What we're going to do
right now in the class, what is it, Google Classroom sort of site where the syllabus is also there, and you'll see that I've scanned it for you, the first 48 pages of the blind owl in its English translation.
Yeah. So, but are we gonna read it only, or should we present something?
We can discuss it.
All right.
But rather than have, what I like better, rather than a conventional sort of academic format where I would say, let's all 14 of us write about the blind owl. I would prefer you write about something you scavenge and excavate from whatever remote territories you want. Right? Yeah. So choose at will, whatever the most fascinating is, and then just elaborate sort of your complex ideas of what is happening there, how it works. Like again, like a perfect little music box or a machine. Sort of just explain the gears and the ingredients of it.
All right, got it.
So everybody will find a myth. 2 or 3 of you can actually present them next week. And again, it's fine. Then we know you're going, but the others you can volunteer at will. If you like what you ended up manifesting and you thought it was a cool thing you found, once you know what you have, you can just sort of, you can offer it then. Sound good? All right, excellent. This was fun, everybody. Thanks. It's a lot on the first day. Like I said, I like to overdose people in the first session. So it was good stuff.
Thank you. That was wonderful.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jason.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
See you next week.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.